Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Smile Cult. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. It began with Mrs. Gable. She was a Tuesday, 10 a.m., a routine scale and polish she'd been booking for the better part of a decade. She was a woman whose face I knew better than some of my own relatives, a landscape of fine lines and anxious tics around the mouth. But not today. Today, Mrs. Gable smiled. It wasn't her usual tight-lipped greeting. This was a wide, bright, unwavering grin. Her lips were stretched thin over her teeth, the corners cranked upwards with an almost geometric precision. It was the kind of smile you see in toothpaste commercials, a sterile performance of happiness. It stayed on her face as she settled into the chair, as I clipped the paper bib around her neck, as I tilted her back. "All right, Judith," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet of the clinic. "Just the usual clean today. Open wide for me." Her smile didn't falter. She simply parted her lips, the grin remaining fixed at the corners of her mouth. It was like a mask cracking open. The effect was deeply unsettling. Throughout the entire procedure, the scrape of the scaler against enamel, the uncomfortable spray of the water jet, the gritty polish, the smile remained. Her eyes, magnified by my loupes, were placid, distant. They didn't crinkle at the corners. They were just looking. "You're doing wonderfully, Judith," I murmured, more to reassure myself than her. A real trooper. She didn't respond, of course. She couldn't. But the smile, that perfect, sterile smile, felt like an answer in itself. When I finished and sat her upright, she closed her mouth and the grin snapped back into place, seamless. She blinked slowly, handed me her health fund card, and left with a silent, smiling nod. I stood for a moment in the disinfected air, the hum of the suction unit the only sound. I chalked it up to a new meditation technique. Or perhaps Botox. A very, very aggressive round of Botox. Brisbane was full of people chasing youth with the subtlety of a jackhammer. My name is Casey. I'm a dental hygienist. For 38 hours a week, I navigate the intimate, anxious space of other people's mouths. My life is a cycle of sterilization, of scraping away decay and polishing surfaces to a temporary, fleeting perfection. I live in a quiet street in the Gap, a leafy Brisbane suburb where the loudest sound is usually the shrieking of cockatoos at dusk. I live alone, unless you count Buster, my geriatric border collie whose breath is worse than my most challenging periodontal case. He's 14, mostly deaf, and his hips are shot, but his presence is a warm, snoring anchor in the quiet of my house. My world is small, ordered, and clean. I like it that way. It's a bulwark against the messiness I spend my days tidying. My anxieties are mundane: Buster's health, the rising cost of lettuce, a nagging fear of being found dead and half-eaten by my beloved, starving pet. The usual singleton stuff. The day after Mrs. Gable's appointment, Mr. Sharma came in. He was a nervous patient, a man whose hands were usually twisted into knots in his lap. Today, he walked in smiling. The same smile. Wide, tight, unwavering. His knuckles were relaxed. He sat in a chair, opened his mouth without being asked, and stared at the ceiling with that same placid disinterest as I worked. I felt a prickle of unease. "New outlook on life, Mr. Sharma?" I asked, my voice a little too loud. His eyes didn't move. The smile remained, a silent, white rictus. I mentioned it to Liam at lunch. Liam was the other hygienist, a cheerful, uncomplicated guy who still thought gnarly was a viable adjective. We were sitting in the staff room, the scent of antiseptic clashing with my microwaved curry. "Had a couple of weirdly happy patients," I said, poking at a piece of cauliflower. "Like, Stepford wives happy. They just sit there, smiling. even with a scaler under their gum line. Liam laughed, spraying crumbs of his sandwich. Maybe you've just got that magic touch, Case. Or maybe it's a TikTok thing. You know, like that planking rubbish from years ago. The dental dare or something. Smile through the pain. It's the same smile, though, I insisted. Exactly the same. You're overthinking it, he said, waving a dismissive hand. You stare into mouths all day. It's making you weird. He was probably right. I was tired. Work was repetitive. Maybe I was projecting my own yearning for some kind of placid contentment onto my patients. I let it go. But then I saw it on the bus home. A teenager, earbuds in, staring out the window. His face was turned in profile, but the corner of his mouth was hooked upwards into that telltale shape. I watched him for 3 stops. He never moved, never blinked, just stared out at the passing suburban sprawl with that fixed, empty grin. A chill that had nothing to do with the bus's Arctic air conditioning crawled up my spine. Coincidence, I told myself. It's a big city. Lots of people smile. That evening, I was washing dishes, looking out the kitchen window into the darkening backyard. The security light flickered on, illuminating the patchy lawn and the sagging hills hoist. Buster was standing on the grass, utterly still. His head was low, a faint tremor running through his old body. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest. It was a sound I hadn't heard from him in years. I slid open the glass door. Buster? What is it, boy? He didn't turn. He was staring intently at the darkened glass of the door, at his own faint reflection. He saw himself, a silhouette of a dog in the light spill, and he was growling at it with a deep, primal fear. Hey, it's just you, you silly old sausage, I cooed, stepping out and stroking his back. His fur was stiff, bristling. He ignored me, his gaze locked on the reflection. I looked too, seeing myself standing behind him, a pale, worried ghost in the glass. I forced a smile to my lips, a silly, reassuring one for my dog. But in the dim reflection, my expression looked distorted, unfamiliar. Buster's growl intensified, his lip curling back from his teeth. He wasn't growling at his reflection. He was growling at mine. I let my smile drop, a sudden cold dread washing over me. Buster's growling subsided to a low whine. I backed away, sliding the door shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stood in my kitchen, in the silent house, and watched my dog stare at the door, on guard against the smiling monster he had seen in the glass. Underscore 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 underscore. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in self-deception. I constructed a fortress of rationalizations, each one flimsy but, when stacked together, just enough to keep the rising tide of panic at bay. The smiling people were a product of a new antidepressant with weird side effects. They were members of some benign self-help group, a Brisbane chapter of the Power of Positive Thinking. The city was hosting an international convention for mimes. Each theory was more absurd than the last, but they were a shield against the alternative, that something was fundamentally, quietly, going wrong. The smiles were becoming more frequent. I'd see them in the queue at Woolworths, a blank-faced woman with the telltale grin, her hand hovering over the F-pose machine as if waiting for a silent command. I saw a man in a business suit, standing perfectly still on the pedestrian bridge over Coronation Drive, smiling at the rushing traffic below. He was there in the morning, and when I passed on the bus on my way home, he was still there, in the exact same spot, his smile unwavering as the sun dipped towards the horizon. At work, it was an epidemic. At least half my patients now bore the smile. They had ceased bringing books or scrolling through their phones in the waiting room. They just sat, hands folded in their laps, smiling at the pot plant in the corner. Communication broke down. My cheerful greetings were met with silence. My instructions, turn your head to the left, rinse now, were followed with a slight delay, as if the request had to be routed through some new, sluggish operating system. They were placid, compliant, and utterly terrifying. The worst part was their silence. The small talk, the lifeblood of a service industry professional, was gone. There were no more complaints about the weather, no stories about the grandkids, no awkward confessions about forgetting to floss. There was only the hum of the equipment, my own strained voice, and the soundless, relentless smiling. I tried to talk to Liam again, this time with more urgency. I'd started a journal, a small black moleskine I kept in my bag. In it, I'd sketched the smile, trying to capture its uncanny uniformity. The precise angle of the corners. The way it didn't engage the zygomaticus major muscle, the real smile muscle. It was all orbicularis oris, a simple, mechanical contraction. Liam, look, I said, cornering him by the autoclave. I showed him the sketch. This is what I'm talking about. It's not a real smile. It's like a logo, branded onto their faces. He glanced at the drawing, then at me. His own easy grin faltered for a second. Case, you're getting obsessed. They're just people smiling. It's a good thing, isn't it? The world could use more of it. But they don't talk, I hissed, my voice low. Mrs. Henderson came in this morning. She talks the leg off a chair. Today. Nothing. Just this. I mimicked the smile, stretching my lips. It felt alien on my own face. Liam took a step back. Okay, you need to take a break. Seriously. You've got leave days saved up. Take a long weekend. Go to the coast. Decompress. He looked genuinely concerned, but it was a concern for my sanity, not for the creeping horror I was trying to describe. He didn't see it. He couldn't, or wouldn't. The denial was a wall I couldn't breach. That conversation was a turning point. It was the moment I realized I was truly alone in this. My perception had shifted, and the world hadn't shifted with me. I was the anomaly, not them. My isolation deepened. I stopped trying to talk about it. I'd go to work, my stomach in a tight knot, and move through my day like an automaton. I'd put on my mask and gloves, my professional armor, and face the silent, smiling ranks. Then I'd go home, lock the door, and fall into the oppressive quiet of my house. The only one who seemed to understand was Buster. His strange behavior had become a consistent, validating barometer of the wrongness. Our evening walks, once a meandering sniff-and scout, became tense patrols. He would freeze, hackles raised, if we saw a smiler. He'd let out that low, warning growl, pulling me insistently in the opposite direction. He could spot them from 100 meters away. A smiling woman reading on a park bench. A grinning man washing his car. Buster saw them, and he knew they were a threat. This became my secondary obsession, a mystery I could actually investigate. While the smile remained an unknowable horror, Buster's reaction was data. I devoured articles and studies online. Canine sensory perception. Infrasound detection in dogs. Pheromonal triggers for canine aggression. I fell down a rabbit hole of fringe science and veterinary journals. Was he hearing something I couldn't? A subsonic hum emanating from these people? Was he smelling them? A chemical change, a pheromone of placidity that his primal instincts registered as alien, as predator? One night, I sat on the floor with my laptop, Buster's head in my lap. I found a forum for owners of anxious dogs. I typed out a post, my fingers hovering over the keys, trying to phrase it in a way that sounded sane. Subject: strange new trigger for dogs' anxiety. Hi everyone. My 14-year-old BC has recently started reacting aggressively, growling, raised hackles, to certain strangers. The weird thing is, it seems to be a specific type of person. They're always completely placid, and they often have a very wide, fixed smile. He never did this before. He's also started growling at his own reflection. Has anyone experienced anything similar? I'm wondering if it's a sound they're making that I can't hear, or maybe a scent. I hit post and felt a ridiculous surge of hope. Maybe someone, somewhere, had an answer. Maybe I wasn't losing my mind. The world outside was getting quieter. I only noticed it when I consciously listened. The distant rumble of traffic on Waterworks Road seemed thinner. There were fewer planes slicing the sky on their way to Brisbane Airport. The neighborhood kids who usually turned the street into a cacophony of shrieks and bouncing balls after school were gone. I hadn't seen them in a week. The silence was a vacuum, and the smile was rushing in to fill it. The smiling people seemed to be increasing in number, a silent, swelling congregation. They weren't doing anything overtly menacing. They just were. Standing in their gardens, watering roses with blank, happy faces. Sitting on their porches, smiling at the setting sun. But there was a new element creeping in, something that turned my blood to ice. Synchronicity. I was waiting at a crosswalk when I saw it. On the other side of the street, 3 people stood waiting for the light to change. A young woman in gym gear, an elderly man with a walker, a tradesman in high-vis. All 3 had the smile. When the little green man lit up, they all began to walk at the exact same moment, their left feet hitting the asphalt in perfect, unnerving unison. It was a tiny thing, a microsecond of shared choreography, but it was as loud as a scream. Later that day, I saw a flock of them, maybe 10 or 12, in the local park. They were all standing in a loose circle on the grass, their faces tilted up towards the bright, unforgiving sun. As I watched from the car, they all raised their right hands to shield their eyes. Not one after another. Not in a wave. All at once. A single, fluid, coordinated gesture performed by a dozen disconnected bodies. They were a hive. A quiet, smiling, terrifying hive. I drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. That night, I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows. I sat in the dark living room, Buster asleep at my feet, his snores a comforting, organic sound in the encroaching silence. I refreshed the dog forum page again and again. Finally, there was one reply. From a user named Oracle7. I've seen it too. Not with a dog. With myself. Be careful. They're not just smiling. They're listening. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. They're not just smiling. They're listening. The words from Oracle 7 echoed in the silent house. They were a confirmation and a new, terrible question. Listening for what? With what? Their ears? Or was it something else, some sense I didn't possess? The message was a tiny spark in the crushing darkness of my isolation, but it also lit up the edges of a much larger, more terrifying landscape. My life now had 2 distinct zones, the fortress of my small house, and the alien territory beyond my front door. Inside, there was Buster's reassuringly smelly presence, the familiar creak of the floorboards, the hum of the old refrigerator. It was my baseline reality, my control group. Outside, the world was a living experiment I was forced to observe. The journal became my confidant, my therapist, my only friend who believed me. I stopped sketching the smile, its form was burned into my memory, and started documenting the patterns. October 17th, saw a group of 6 smilers outside the Bardon news agency. They were all looking at a "for lease" sign in the window. When a car backfired down the street, their heads all snapped towards the sound in perfect unison. Like a flock of birds. But slower, more deliberate. October 19th. The checkout girl at the IGA. The smile. She didn't speak, just pointed to the total on the screen. The woman in line behind me also had the smile. They didn't acknowledge each other, but they blinked at the same time. I timed it. Twice. October 22nd. Liam has it. I knew it was coming. He came into the staff room this morning, put his lunch in the fridge, and just stood there, smiling at the wall. The same empty, perfect grin. I said his name. He turned his head slowly, the smile fixed, and just looked at me. His eyes were like glass. I locked myself in the sterilization room for 10 minutes, just breathing. The practice is finished. I can't go back. I sent an email to the clinic manager, citing a family emergency, and never went back. The money would be a problem eventually. But the thought of standing in that small room, surrounded by silent, smiling people, one of whom used to be my friend, was unbearable. My world had shrunk to the size of my property line. My only connection to the outside, to a shared sanity, was Oracle 7. After that first cryptic message, I'd sent a private message. Me, who are you? Where are you? You said you've seen it. The reply came hours later. Oracle 7, I'm in Kenmore. Not far from you. I see them every day. They took my husband. Not took, exactly. He just joined them. Woke up one morning last week and he was just sitting on the edge of the bed, smiling. Me, I'm so sorry. My colleague, Liam. He's one of them now. They don't talk. They just smile. And they move together sometimes. Oracle 7, it's the silence that gets you. The world is going quiet. Have you noticed the streetlights? The streetlights. I hadn't. That night, I watched from my bedroom window. The orange glow that washed the street was no longer constant. It was pulsing. A slow, steady, rhythmic pulse. On, brighter, off. On, brighter, off. It was so subtle I could have missed it if I wasn't looking for it. It was like a slow, deep breath. Me, yes. They're pulsing. Like a heartbeat. Oracle 7, it's not a heartbeat. It's a signal. A carrier wave. I think that's how it spreads. Through light and sound. Something low, something high, something we can't quite perceive. But they can. And some people are more susceptible. Oracle 7's theory latched onto my own vague fears about infrasound and gave them a terrifying structure. A contagion that spread not through germs, but through waves. A mimetic virus transmitted by the very infrastructure of the city. It was insane, but it was the only explanation that fit the quiet, creeping madness. We began communicating daily, a frantic exchange of observations and theories through the fragile anonymity of the forum's messaging system. Meanwhile, Buster's role as my canary in the coal mine became even more crucial. He was my early warning system. His agitation was a direct measure of the phenomenon's proximity and intensity. One afternoon, he started whining and pacing frantically around the living room, his claws clicking on the timber floors. He kept looking up at the ceiling, at the main light fixture. I couldn't see or hear anything, but his distress was palpable. A few minutes later, my neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a retiree who usually spent his afternoons noisily hedging his lily-pilly, walked out his front door. He was a smiler now. He stood on his lawn, smiling at my house. Buster went ballistic, barking and throwing himself at the front window, his fear a visceral thing. Mr. Henderson didn't react. He just stood there, smiling, for an hour, before turning and walking back inside. It was a message. We see you. We know you're in there. My secondary investigation, Buster's senses, became intertwined with the primary threat. Oracle 7 suggested I try to record the ambient sound in the house, to see if I could capture whatever Buster was hearing. I downloaded a spectrum analyzer app on my phone. Most of the time, it showed the normal range of household noises. But during Buster's periods of high anxiety, a thin, sharp spike would appear on the graph, way up in the high-frequency range, a sound my own ears couldn't register. It was there, a silent scream piercing the quiet of my home. This discovery hardened my resolve. It was real. I wasn't crazy. Buster was my proof. My small suburban house, once a symbol of my quiet, lonely life, was now a sanctuary and a prison. I began to map the anomaly's progress through the sounds that disappeared. First, the distant traffic faded. Then, the morning chorus of birdsong became thinner, more muted. The neighborhood dogs, who used to set each other off in a chain reaction of barking, fell silent. Only Buster still made a sound. The silence was the canvas upon which the smile painted its masterpiece. The smiling people became the only sign of life, a silent, synchronized tableau. They'd emerge from their houses in the morning, get into their cars, and drive away, presumably to whatever jobs they still had. But there was no morning rush. No blaring horns, no shouted goodbyes. Just a silent, orderly procession of smiling drivers in their metal boxes. The subplot I had stumbled into, this sonic element, grew more menacing. I started noticing a correlation. When the high-frequency spike on my analyzer app was at its strongest, the smiler's synchronicity was most pronounced. One evening, the spike was screaming on the app, a solid red line at the top of the graph. I peeked through the blinds. On the street, every smiler who was outside, a woman checking her letterbox, a man weeding his garden, a teenager on a skateboard, all stopped. They turned their heads in unison to look up at the full moon. They stood like that for several minutes, a silent, moon-worshipping congregation of the damned, before simultaneously turning back to their pointless tasks. The fear was a physical thing now, a constant sour taste at the back of my throat. My supplies were running low. I hadn't left the house in over a week. The thought of navigating a supermarket full of them, of facing their silent, smiling judgment, was paralyzing. Oracle 7 became my lifeline. Our conversations were the only thing keeping the encroaching madness at bay. Oracle 7, they're organizing. It's not just random synchronicity anymore. There's a purpose to it. I saw a group of them this morning, taking down a "for sale" sign from a house on my street. They worked together. No words. Just, efficient. Like ants. Me, what do we do? We can't just stay in our houses forever. Oracle 7, we have to get out. Out of the city. Away from the signals. I have a car, full tank of petrol. I have a place we can go, a friend's old property out past Esk off the grid. No power lines, no towers. We could be safe there. Me, how? We can't just walk out the door. They're everywhere. Oracle 7, there's a power substation a few kilometers from me. It controls the grid for this whole quadrant of the city. The lights, the towers, everything. I've been watching it. The smilers avoid it. The electromagnetic field is too chaotic, maybe. It interferes with their signal. If we could get there, we could meet up. From there, it's a straight shot to the highway. A plan. A desperate, crazy plan, but it was a plan. It was hope. The thought of meeting another sane person, of sharing this burden in person, was a powerful lure. Me, when? Oracle 7, tomorrow night. During the deepest part of the night. Less of them are out then. They seem to follow a solar cycle. I'll send you the location. Be careful, Casey. Don't trust anyone else. Just me. The relief was so intense it made me dizzy. I spent the next 24 hours preparing, packing a bug-out bag with tins of dog food, bottled water, my journal, a first aid kit, and a heavy mag light. I kept my phone charged, watching the spectrum analyzer, waiting for a dip in the high-frequency noise. I talked to Buster, explaining the plan in low, urgent tones. He seemed to understand, staying close, his warm body pressed against my leg. As night fell, a profound sense of dread mingled with the hope. I was about to leave my fortress, my only known safe space. I went over the plan with Oracle 7-1 last time via the forums chat. The location was a small park adjacent to the substation. Easy to find. Oracle 7, see you soon. We can beat this. Together. I closed the laptop and stood up, my heart pounding. It was time. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the computer. A pale, tired, terrified face. And beside my own reflection, I saw the forum page, still open. I saw Oracle 7's profile picture. It was a small, stylized icon, a graphic someone had designed. A simple, minimalist logo. It was 2 upturned crescents and 2 dots. A cartoon smiley face. And its shape, the precise curve of the lips, the empty, round eyes, was an exact, perfect replica of the smile. The chat wasn't a lifeline. It was a lure. The fisherman wasn't offering me a hand, it was showing me the bait. My one ally in this nightmare was one of them. It had been listening, learning, studying me. And now it was drawing me out into the open. The trap was set. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The air in the room went thin and sharp. The relief that had buoyed me for the last 24 hours evaporated, replaced by an icy, sinking dread. The avatar. The friendly, stylized smiley face was a cartoon mockery of the horror on the streets. Oracle 7 wasn't an ally. It was a Judas goat, a digital lure leading me from my pen. How long had it been one of them? Was the story about the husband a lie? Or was it the truth, told by a mind that was in the process of being overwritten, a final, fading echo of the person who used to be there? The message, be careful. They're not just smiling. Their listening took on a new, horrifying dimension. It wasn't a warning. It was a boast. My blood ran cold. The plan to meet, the substation, the safe house out past Esk, all of it was a lie designed to get me to do one thing, leave my house. To step out into their world. Buster whined, sensing the sudden shift in my emotional state. I knelt and buried my face in his thick fur, my hands trembling. It was a trap, buddy, I whispered into his ear. It was all a trap. My investigation, my desperate search for answers, had led me directly into the enemy's sights. The forum, my supposed sanctuary of shared experience, was compromised. How many of the other users were real? How many were lures, patiently trolling for the last pockets of resistance? I looked at my phone, at the Spectrum Analyzer app. The thin red line of the high-frequency sound was still there, a constant, silent needle aimed at my brain. Oracle 7's theory about the carrier wave was probably true. That felt like the most terrifying part. It had given me the truth, or a version of it, mixed with the lie. It was using the mechanics of its own contagion as bait. It was a predator that explained the workings of its own jaws to the prey, confident it wouldn't matter. The stakes had escalated beyond just my personal survival. This wasn't a passive phenomenon. It was active. It was intelligent. It was hunting. I shut down the laptop, severing the connection. The silence in the house pressed in, heavier than before. The planned escape was off, but the threat was no longer just outside. It had been inside my home, in my conversations, for days. The house, my fortress, now felt like a fishbowl. They knew I was here. They knew I was different. Mr. Henderson, standing on his lawn, smiling at my window. The perfectly timed blinks of the women in the supermarket line. Oracle 7. They were all connected, nodes in a network, and I was a glitch they were trying to isolate and delete. The nature of the threat began to coalesce in my mind, shifting from a vague environmental horror to something more like an alien intelligence. Not alien in the sense of spaceships and little green men, but alien in its very nature. A consciousness, perhaps, spreading like mold, a mimetic life form that used human bodies as hosts and the city's infrastructure as its circulatory system. It didn't need to speak. Its language was synchronicity, shared action, and the single, unifying symbol of the smile. It was overriding human culture with a silent, placid, terrifyingly efficient new one. And it was escalating. The next morning, the low hum started. It wasn't the high-frequency sound on the app, this was audible, a deep, resonant bass note that seemed to vibrate up through the floorboards. It was the sound of a massive engine idling somewhere far away. Buster hated it. He paced and whined, unable to settle. I peered through the blinds. The street was a hive of quiet activity. A dozen smilers were out. They weren't performing their usual mundane tasks. They were working. A group of them was systematically dismantling a garden fence from a house down the street, passing the palings from one to another in a silent, fluid chain. Another group was on the roof of the house opposite, removing the terracotta tiles one by one and stacking them in perfect, neat piles on the lawn. There was no reason for it. They were disassembling the neighborhood. Deconstructing it. It was organized, purposeful, and completely insane. They moved with an unnerving grace, their smiles fixed and serene as they took apart the world I knew. The power grid, which had been flickering for weeks, became more unstable. The lights in my house would dim and surge. The low hum would intensify with each surge. I realized what it was. It was the sound of the grid being repurposed. The power wasn't just for lighting homes anymore, it was being channeled, focused. It was feeding the signal. My fortress was beginning to fail. The food was running low, but more importantly, the psychological pressure was becoming immense. The constant hum, the sight of the silent deconstruction outside, the knowledge that I was being watched by a networked intelligence, it was a siege on my sanity. I had to do something. Staying here was a slow death. But going outside was a fast one. My gaze fell on the heavy mag light in my bug-out bag. A thought, desperate and half-formed, began to spark. If their signal was carried on light and sound, could it be disrupted? Oracle 7, the entity posing as an ally, had said they avoided the substation because the electromagnetic field was too chaotic. Chaos was the enemy of order. Synchronicity was their strength. Dissonance might be their weakness. I spent the next 2 days in a fever of manic preparation. I found every device in the house that could make a loud, unpredictable noise. An old battery-powered radio, a smoke alarm I ripped from the ceiling, a handful of kitchen timers. I downloaded a dozen different white noise, static, and siren apps onto my old tablet. My plan was no longer to escape the city. That was impossible. My plan was to make a stand. To turn my house, my little fishbowl, into a bubble of pure static. A dead zone. The night I chose to act, the hum was louder than ever. The streetlights weren't just pulsing anymore, they were strobing, casting frantic, dancing shadows across my living room walls. The smilers were still outside, working under the strobing light, their movements jerky, puppet-like. I took a deep breath, Buster panting nervously at my side. "Okay, boy," I whispered. "Time to make some noise." I started in the living room. I turned the old radio on, twisting the dial until it was shrieking with static, and set it by the front window. I activated the siren app on my tablet, a deafening, rising and falling wail, and placed it by the back door. I set the kitchen timers to go off at 1-minute intervals and scattered them around the house. Then, I went to the switchboard. I killed the main power to the house, plunging myself into darkness. The hum from outside seemed to intensify, rushing in to fill the new silence. This was the final piece of my plan. I switched on the heavy mag light. Its powerful, focused beam cut through the darkness. I had attached a small, spinning mirrored disco ball, a gag gift from years ago, to a battery-powered motor. I switched it on. The effect was immediate and dizzying. The beam of the mag light hit the spinning ball, shattering into 1,000 frantic, dancing points of light that pinwheeled around the room. It was visual chaos. A storm of light. I stood in the center of my creation, in the heart of my fortress of static. The radio hissed. The tablet wailed. The lights danced. And I waited. Outside, the strobing from the streetlights faltered. The rhythmic deconstruction of the neighborhood paused. I peered through a gap in the blinds. The smilers had stopped what they were doing. They were all standing still, their heads cocked at a slight angle. Their smiles, for the first time, looked strained. The perfect, placid curve of their lips seemed to twitch, to vibrate, as if struggling to hold its shape against the onslaught of my sensory assault. A few of them took a shambling step towards my house, their movements clumsy, unsynchronized. They looked confused. The hive mind was being jammed. It was working. A wild, triumphant laugh escaped my lips. It was a raw, ugly sound, the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. For a moment, a glorious, fleeting moment, I had them. I was the ghost in their machine. I was the static in their perfect signal. But the victory was short-lived. The hum from outside began to change. The deep bass note pitched upwards, rising in frequency, becoming a piercing, physical pressure against my skull. It was adapting. It was focusing its power, trying to punch through my defenses. The strobing streetlights coalesced into a single, blindingly bright, steady beam, aimed directly at my house. The windows rattled in their frames. Buster howled, a sound of pure agony, and tried to scramble under the sofa. The entity I was fighting wasn't just intelligent. It was reactive. It was powerful. And I had just made myself its primary target. I had rung the dinner bell. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The focused beam of light from the street lamp was a physical blow. It bleached all color from the room, turning everything into a stark, overexposed photograph. The sound escalated with it, a high-pitched, harmonic whine that drilled into my bones. It was the sound from the Spectrum Analyzer app, amplified 1,000 times, made audible and weaponized. The little bubble of chaos I had created was being crushed. My makeshift defenses began to fail. The batteries in the tablet died, and the siren cut out abruptly. The radio static dissolved into the overwhelming whine. The dancing lights from the disco ball were swallowed by the intense glare from the window. My fortress was collapsing. Buster was whimpering, a terrible, choked sound. The noise was hurting him far more than it was hurting me. I had to get him out of there. The plan had changed from defense to pure, desperate escape. The confrontation wasn't going to be a battle of wits or technology. It was a simple, primal equation, run or be consumed. Come on, boy. I yelled over the din, my voice sounding thin and reedy. I grabbed the bug-out bag and the mag light and half-dragged Buster towards the back of the house, away from the main beam of light. He was disoriented, stumbling, his old legs struggling to find purchase on the vibrating floor. The back door was my only option. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers numb and clumsy. The whine was inside my head now, a chorus of screaming needles. I wrenched the door open and we stumbled out into the relative darkness of the backyard. The night air was no relief. The hum was everywhere, a palpable texture in the atmosphere. The back fences of the neighboring yards were gone, dismantled. The landscape was open, exposed. And they were coming. Smilers were converging on my property from all sides. They weren't running, they moved with a slow, inexorable purpose, their perfect grins illuminated by the ghastly light spilling from my house. They were ants whose hill had been disturbed, and they were swarming the source of the disruption. We scrambled towards the back fence, or where the fence used to be. My only hope was the darkness of the parkland that bordered my property, a stretch of untamed bush that ran down to a creek. If we could make it into the trees, out of the direct line of sight, maybe we could break the connection. As we ran, my foot caught on something. I fell hard, my hands and knees scraping against loose dirt and grass. The mag light flew from my hand, its beam skittering across the ground. It came to rest pointing at a large shard of a broken mirror lying in the grass, debris from the neighborhood deconstruction. For a split second, the beam illuminated my own reflection. My face. My mouth. The corners of my lips were pulled upwards. Not in a smile of exertion or a grimace of fear. It was a clean, precise, upward curve. It was the beginning of the smile. Tight. Perfect. Alien. The realization hit me with the force of a physical impact, winding me more than the fall itself. The contagion wasn't just outside. It was inside me. It had been working on me this whole time, quietly, patiently. My immunity wasn't immunity at all, it was just a slower, more stubborn infection. My headaches, my fatigue, the ringing in my ears I dismissed as stress, they were symptoms. The house, the locks, the static, I hadn't been keeping it out. I had merely been marinating in it. And Buster. His growling at my reflection in the glass door weeks ago. His anxiety when I was near. He wasn't just sensing the smilers outside. He was sensing the change in me. He was my canary, and I was the poison in the mine. The knowledge was a profound, internal horror that dwarfed the external threat of the approaching figures. My fight for sanity had been against an enemy that was already behind my own eyes. The approaching smilers slowed, their heads tilting. They weren't coming to attack me. They were coming to welcome me. I was a lost sheep stumbling back towards the fold. A wave of utter despair washed over me, a desire to just lie there, to let the smile complete its work, to surrender to the placid silence. It would be so easy. No more fear. No more loneliness. Just connection. But then Buster licked my face, a frantic, wet slap of desperation. He whined, a high, pleading sound, and nudged my hand with his nose. His fear was pure. It wasn't for himself. It was for me. For the person I had been. That simple, loyal act cut through the encroaching paralysis. It was an anchor to my old self, to the messy, anxious, complicated reality I was about to lose. I would not let that dog face this new world alone. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the mag light. I scooped Buster up into my arms, all 20 kilos of his dead weight. He was too old and too terrified to run. "It's okay, boy. I've got you," I grunted, the words feeling thick and strange in my mouth. My facial muscles felt stiff, resistant. I ran. I crashed through the scrubby bushland, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. I didn't look back. Behind me, the terrible whine began to subside, the focused light dimming. The hive had lost its immediate target. For now. I half fell, half slid down the steep bank to the creek bed and splashed through the cold, shallow water, the shock of it clearing my head for a precious moment. I clambered up the other side and kept going, pushing deeper into the darkness of the park, away from the manicured, deconstructed suburbs. I finally collapsed at the base of a huge Moreton Bay fig, its sprawling roots like sleeping giants. I set Buster down gently. He curled up immediately, shivering, his head on my lap. The sounds of the city were distant now, muted by the trees. There was only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the chirping of insects. A normal sound. A beautiful, precious, normal sound. We are in the car now. My old Hyundai, which was parked 2 streets away, miraculously untouched. We have been driving for hours, heading west on the Warrego Highway. Brisbane is a faint, ominous glow in my rearview mirror. The motorway is empty. No other cars. No trucks. Just a silent, black ribbon of asphalt unreeling before me. Buster is in the passenger seat, awake, watching me. He doesn't sleep. Every so often, a low, uncertain growl rumbles in his chest. He's on guard. He's watching me for any sign that the person who saved him is being replaced by the thing we fled. I am concentrating fiercely, not on the road, but on my own face. It's a constant, exhausting battle. The muscles in my cheeks and around my mouth want to pull into that serene, placid configuration. It feels like the most natural expression in the world. A comfortable resting state. To fight it, I have to force a frown. I grimace. I talk. I recite the classification of periodontal diseases, the names of every instrument on my tray, the chemical composition of fluoride varnish. Anything to keep the muscles moving, to assert my own control. Gingivitis, I say to the empty car, my voice hoarse. Chronic periodontitis. Aggressive periodontitis. The words are a charm, an incantation against the silence. I don't know where I'm going. Am I escaping to freedom? Or am I a Trojan horse, a carrier, bringing the quiet contagion to some new, unsuspecting town? The infection is in my blood, in my nerves. Can I outrun something that's already inside me? I glance in the rearview mirror. My expression is a strained, desperate mask. My eyes are wide with terror, but my mouth is fighting a smile. It's there, at the corners, a ghost of the perfect, placid grin, waiting for a moment of weakness to bloom. Buster whines softly. The sun is beginning to rise, painting the desolate landscape in shades of orange and pink. The world is bright, and beautiful, and terrifyingly quiet. And the long road ahead is empty. The quiet contagion. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My world is built of sound, and I am its unwilling architect. Most people hear the city as a single, roaring entity, the groan of the Max train on the steel bridge, the hiss of rain on asphalt, the collective murmur of the Saturday market. I hear the individual bricks of that wall of noise. I hear the squeal of a specific brake pad, the distinctive flutter of a plastic bag caught on a power line, the gnawing, repetitive chew of the man 3 tables away at the cafe. This is misophonia. A neurological tic, a crossed wire in the brain's audio processing center. It's not about volume, it's about texture, pattern, intrusion. It's why I live in a modern apartment in the Pearl District of Portland, where the concrete is thick and the windows are triple paned. It's why I work from home as a freelance sound editor, my sanctuary a small, foam-paneled room where the only sounds that exist are the ones I permit. In here, I am a god, shaping audio waveforms, excising the clicks, pops, and breaths that torment me in the outside world. I take the messy, chaotic noise of human interaction and I purify it. My most consistent client is Ben, a podcast producer whose enthusiasm for local history far outstrips his technical skill. His recordings are a minefield of sloppy microphone placement and ambient bleed. Cleaning his tracks is both a nightmare and a perverse pleasure. It is my penance and my craft. The first time I heard it, I was working on Ben's latest project, Subterranean Portland, Tunnels and Tales. He'd interviewed a civil engineer in a cavernous, echoing city maintenance building. The audio was a mess. I spent an hour eliminating the reverb, filtering the rumble of distant traffic, and delicately snipping out the engineer's wet, smacking lip sounds. I isolated the engineer's voice track, preparing to apply a final noise reduction filter. And there it was. Underneath his calm, baritone explanation of sewage infrastructure, lay a hum. It wasn't the standard 60-cycle electrical hum, I could filter that in my sleep. This was different. Lower, with a strange, almost organic modulation to it. Curious, I cranked the gain, my Sennheiser HD 650s cupping my ears. The hum swelled. It was a low, resonant thrum, like a colossal beehive miles away. And woven into it, almost too faint to be real, was a whisper. It was distorted, stretched, like a recording played at the wrong speed. I leaned closer to my monitor, my own breath held captive. NNNRRA. I ripped the headphones off, my heart hammering against my ribs. The silence of my treated room felt sudden and violent. Auditory pareidolia. The audio equivalent of seeing faces in clouds. My brain, so attuned to finding patterns in noise, had simply invented one. It was a symptom of stress, of spending 12 hours a day listening to the sonic refuse of the world. My own name, whispered from the abyss of a raw audio file. It was narcissistic and absurd. I shook my head, took a deep breath that tasted of foam baffling and dust, and ran my custom noise reduction algorithm. The hum, and the ghost whisper within it, vanished. I sent the clean file to Ben and tried to forget about it. A week later, it happened again. This time the project was an audiobook, a dry historical text read by a professional voice actor in a top-of-the-line studio. The raw files were pristine, almost clinically clean. But when I zoomed in on the waveform, between the actor's perfectly enunciated sentences, I saw it, a faint, consistent line at the very bottom of the frequency spectrum. I isolated a section of silence. Put on my headphones. Turned up the gain. The hum was there. And this time, the whisper was clearer, less distorted. Nora. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A label. My heart didn't pound this time, a cold, slow dread trickled into my stomach. This file was from a studio in Seattle. The last one was from a municipal building downtown. 2 different locations. 2 different sets of equipment, 2 different human subjects. The only common denominators were the hum, the whisper, and me. I spent the next 2 hours running diagnostics on my own gear. I checked every cable, rebooted my audio interface, ran software checks on my editing suite. Everything was perfect. I unplugged my entire setup from the wall, running it off a pure sine wave battery backup to eliminate any chance of dirty power or RF interference from the building's wiring. Then, I plugged in a microphone, a high-sensitivity Neumann U87, and recorded the silence of my own soundproofed room. I opened the new file. Zoomed in. There it was. The thin, dark line of the hum. I put on my headphones, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the volume dial. Nora. It was in my room. It had been there all along. My sanctuary was compromised. The silence I had so carefully curated was a lie. The next day, the city felt different. Or maybe I was different. The rain-slicked streets of the Pearl District, usually a comforting gray canvas, seemed menacing. Every sound was a potential carrier. The whine of a delivery drone, the thrum of a server farm cooling fan from an open grate, the low buzz of the streetcar's overhead lines. Was it in all of them? I needed coffee. I needed a slice of normalcy. I went to my usual spot, a minimalist cafe called Ground State, where the baristas were too cool to make small talk. Maya was behind the counter, her purple hair tied up in a messy bun. She was my one real friend in the city, a tether to the world outside my headphones. The usual, Nora, she asked, already grabbing a mug. Please, I managed, my eyes scanning the other patrons. It was the usual mix, a trio of coders with laptops covered in stickers, a woman sketching in a moleskine, a man in a pristine rain jacket reading a paperback. Normal. Then I saw him. A man sitting alone by the window, his coffee untouched. He was thin, with a neatly trimmed beard, and he was staring intently at the conduit pipe running along the ceiling. His head was cocked at a slight angle, an expression of rapt concentration on his face. He wasn't looking at the pipe so much as listening to it. His stillness was absolute, profound. He was a statue dedicated to the hum of household electricity. Weirdo, right? Maya whispered, placing my latte on the counter. Been like that for 20 minutes. Hasn't blinked. I stared at him, a cold knot tightening in my chest. It was the focus, the sheer, unadulterated intent. It was the way I must look when I'm deep in an edit, chasing a phantom frequency. But he was doing it in public, aimed at the mundane infrastructure of a coffee shop. I took my coffee and sat as far away from him as I could. I tried to read the news on my phone, but my focus was shattered. I could feel the low-frequency vibrations of the cafe's refrigerator, the ballast of the overhead lights. Were they whispering my name, too? Was he hearing it? Later that week, I had a progress call with Ben. The files sound amazing, Nora. Seriously, you're a magician. I don't know how you get all the gunk out. Ben, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. Have you ever noticed a low-level hum in your recordings? Below the usual room tone. There was a pause. You mean like a 60 cycle? Yeah, all the time. Comes with using cheap extension cords. No, something else. Something, patterned. He laughed, a crackly sound over the video call. Nora, you're too good at your job. You're hearing ghosts in the machine. Don't worry about it. As long as I can't hear it, we're golden. Ghosts in the machine. That's what it felt like. But it wasn't the machine that was haunted. It was the air itself. My work became a series of meticulous, paranoid excavations. On every project, I hunted for the hum. It was always there. Sometimes buried deep, a mere flicker on my spectrum analyzer. Other times, it was bold, audacious, sitting right under the main dialogue. The whisper of my name became a constant, unwelcome companion. Nora. 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 It was a mantra, a tuning fork, a declaration. I started taking my portable recording gear with me when I left the apartment. I recorded the ambient sound of the waterfront, the hushed halls of the Powell's City of Books, the windy expanse of the Tillicum Crossing Bridge. I'd rush back to my sanctuary, load the files, and search. The hum was everywhere. It was in the rustle of leaves in the South Park blocks. It was in the gush of the Willamette River. It was in the silence between raindrops. The entire city was vibrating at a frequency only I seemed to be able to isolate. And inside that vibration, it whispered my name. My name wasn't a ghost in the machine anymore. It was the ghost of the machine. And its voice was getting louder. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The world began to tilt. Not suddenly, but with the slow, inexorable creep of a glacier. The change was auditory at first. I started hearing the hum without the aid of my equipment. It was a faint pressure in my ears, a sub-bass thrum that vibrated up through the soles of my feet from the city's concrete bones. It was the first thing I heard in the morning and the last thing I heard at night. The whisper was still confined to recordings, a mercy, I thought, but the hum was now my constant, unwelcome shadow. The listeners became more common. They were a new, quiet tribe occupying the city's margins. A woman in a business suit on a park bench, her lunch forgotten in her lap, her gaze fixed on a humming electrical transformer across the street. A teenager on the streetcar, phone dark in his hand, his head tilted back as if savoring the rattling vibration of the car's chassis. A line of people at the grocery store, all subtly cocking their heads toward the ceiling, their expressions placid, almost beatific, as they bathed in the drone of the fluorescent lights. They never spoke of it. They never looked at each other. They were an archipelago of silent listeners, each on their own island of sound. When the source of their focus was interrupted, when the train stopped, when the transformer went quiet, they would blink slowly, as if coming out of a dream, and resume their lives with a serene, unsettling smoothness. My isolation deepened. The very nature of my work, which had once been a refuge, was now the source of my torment. To do my job, I had to immerse myself in the contagion, to amplify the whisper that was poisoning my reality. I tried to talk to Maya again. I found her on her break, sitting behind ground state, smoking a cigarette. Maya, I started, trying to sound casual. Have you noticed people seem distracted lately? Like they're listening to something that isn't there. She took a long drag, exhaling a plume of smoke into the damp air. Everyone in Portland is always listening to something that isn't there. It's called a podcast. No, I'm serious. It's a specific kind of listening. A focus. Like the guy in the cafe last week. She flicked her ash, her eyes drifting to a large, rattling air conditioning unit bolted to the brick wall behind me. Her brow furrowed, but not with concern. With interest. You know, she said, her voice softer, if you really pay attention, it's kind of a nice sound. The rhythm of it. It's steady. A small, strange smile touched her lips. She was looking past me, through me, at the sound. Her head tilted, just a fraction of an inch. A wave of vertigo washed over me. She was one of them. Or she was becoming one of them. The contagion was seeping into the cracks of my life, claiming the few people I cared about. Maya. I said, my voice small. She blinked, her focus snapping back to me. What? Oh, yeah. People are weird. What were you saying? I couldn't bring myself to repeat it. The conversation was pointless. Talking about the phenomenon with someone who was succumbing to it was like describing the color blue to a person who had only ever seen red. They lacked the frame of reference, or worse, their frame was actively, quietly shifting. That night, I started a journal. Not a diary of feelings, but a log. A sonic log. I documented every instance of the hum. Its perceived amplitude, and the location. I catalogued every listener I saw, noting their posture, the object of their fixation, the duration of their trance. I became a naturalist of the uncanny, my notebook filling with observations that would sound like paranoid delusions to anyone else. Date, October 14th. Location, Pioneer Courthouse Square. Subject, male, approximate 50. Fixation, the underground max station ventilation grate. Duration, 17 minutes. Note, subject swayed gently, as if to a melody. Date, October 16th. Location, my apartment. Ambient hum at -45 dB on my meter. Strongest near the fuse box. Whisper on recording is clearer tonight. It almost sounds expectant. My paranoia needed a project, a direction beyond simple observation. I began to research. Mass hysteria, shared psychological phenomena, acoustic weaponry. My search history became a catalog of fringe science and conspiracy. I fell down a rabbit hole of articles about the hum, a real-world phenomenon where people in certain locations report hearing a persistent, low-frequency sound that has no identifiable source. But those were just hums. They didn't come with an army of placid listeners. And they didn't whisper your name. Then I found it. It was buried in a 20-year-old digital archive of a defunct local tech magazine. The article was titled Aura Sync, Portland's .com dream turns into a sonic nightmare. The piece described a startup from the late 90s, founded by a reclusive engineer named Dr. Alastair Finch. Aura Sync's mission was utopian and absurd, to harmonize the city's ambient electromagnetic and acoustic frequencies, creating a resonance field that would subtly reduce stress and improve focus for the entire population. They had built a transmitter, a central hub, and for a few weeks in 1999, they had run a secret, citywide test. The project was shut down abruptly. The article was vague on the details, citing NDAs and sealed corporate documents. But it mentioned rumors. Test participants, employees and their families, reporting persistent auditory hallucinations. A shared, recurring whisper. Uncharacteristic, obsessive behaviors. The project was shuttered, the company dissolved, and Dr. Finch vanished from the public eye. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn damp. This wasn't new. It was a ghost. A piece of old, failed technology reawakened. Fueled by a new, terrifying purpose, I took my search to the dark corners of the internet. I found my way onto obscure audio engineering forums and experimental sound art message boards, places where discussions of weaponized frequencies and psychoacoustics weren't immediately dismissed. Under a pseudonym, Cassandra_Hertz, I posted a carefully worded query. I described the exact frequency of the hum I had isolated, a steady 43.2 Hz, just below the lowest G on a piano. I described its unique waveform, its resistance to standard noise cancellation. I mentioned the pareidolia, the tendency for the brain to interpret a name within it. I asked if anyone had ever encountered such a signal. The responses were what I expected. Check your grounding. Sounds like classic RF bleed from a cell tower. Lay off the drugs, man. But then, a week after I posted, I received a private message. It was from a user with a nonsensical name, a string of random characters. The account had been created that day. The message contained only 2 sentences. It's not a ghost in the machine. It's the machine in the ghost. Stop listening. I tried to reply, to ask what it meant, who they were. But it was too late. When I clicked on their username, the site returned an error. This user's account has been deleted. The machine in the ghost. The phrase echoed in my mind. It felt like a key, but I couldn't find the lock it belonged to. Stop listening. How could I? It was my job. It was my curse. And now, it was everywhere. The city was a machine, humming a single, monotonous song. And I was the ghost it was calling to. My research into EarthSync gave me a name and a potential location. The company's last known address, according to old business filings, was a warehouse in the Southeast Industrial District. A sprawling maze of rust-colored buildings and forgotten railway lines. It was a place where things went to die, old businesses, old technologies, old dreams. It seemed like the perfect place to find a ghost. One gray, drizzly Saturday, I drove my car to the address. The warehouse was enormous, a corrugated steel box with faded lettering on its side, EarthSync, and below it, a tagline in a cheerful, futuristic font, "Tune your world." The windows were boarded up, the roll-up doors rusted shut. It looked like it hadn't been touched in 20 years. I circled the building, my portable recorder in hand, its meter already registering the hum, stronger here than anywhere else in the city. I found a small access door on the side, its lock long since rusted through. With a groan of protesting metal, I pulled it open and slipped inside. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The air inside the EarthSync warehouse was thick and still, tasting of dust, rust, and ozone. Faint light filtered through grimy clerestory windows high above, illuminating a cavern of ghosts. Desks and chairs were still arranged in ghostly pods, covered in a thick blanket of gray dust. Old, beige CRT monitors sat like cyclopean skulls on the desks. Papers were scattered across the floor, curled and yellowed with age. It was a perfect, hermetically sealed tomb of the dot-com bust. My recorder's needle was quivering near the red. The 43.2 Hz hum was a palpable presence here, a physical pressure against my eardrums. I didn't need headphones to know what it was whispering. My name was in the very atoms of the air. Nora. 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 It was a possessive, intimate sound. A sound that knew me. I made my way through the maze of abandoned workstations, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. In the center of the vast space, under a high bay ceiling, was the machine. It wasn't a single device, but an array. A circular platform held a central column of humming capacitors and copper coils, from which thick, black cables snaked out to a ring of what looked like satellite dishes, all pointed inward at the column. It looked like a temple built by a cult that worshipped radio waves. A faint, blue-white corona of static electricity danced around the central pillar. It was dormant, yet it was undeniably on. A low, foundational thrum emanated from it, the source of the entire city's infection. Nearby was a closed office, the words, "Dr. A. Finch, Director," still visible on a tarnished brass plaque. The door was unlocked. Inside, the scene was more chaotic. Books on acoustics, neuroscience, and Eastern philosophy were piled everywhere. Schematics and blueprints were pinned to every wall, covered in frantic, handwritten notes. I unrolled one of the blueprints. It was a map of Portland, but overlaid with a complex web of concentric circles and energy flow diagrams. The warehouse was the epicenter. The lines radiated outwards, following the paths of power grids, water mains, and fiber optic cables. Finch hadn't just wanted to broadcast a signal, he had wanted to turn the entire city's infrastructure into his instrument. I found his journal on the desk. A leather-bound book filled with a tight, spidery script. The early entries were clinical, full of optimism. Phase 1 trial successful. The 43.2 Hz resonance is stable. It seems to have a calming effect on the subjects, as predicted. They report a sense of clarity and quiet focus. But as the entries progressed, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew more erratic, the scientific detachment giving way to something messianic. The resonance field requires an anchor. A focal point to stabilize the signal across a complex urban environment. A simple broadcast isn't enough. It needs to be symbiotic. It needs to find a human consciousness with the perfect sympathetic resonance. A keystone. My blood ran cold. I flipped through the pages, my hands shaking, sending up a small puff of dust. The system is searching. It scans, it listens, it waits. It's looking for a specific neuroacoustic signature. Someone highly sensitive to auditory patterns, someone whose brain is already primed to decode signal from noise. Once it finds its keystone, the full harmonization can begin. The city will become one mind, one song. A quiet, peaceful unity. The final entry was a single, scrawled sentence, dated the day before the company was shuttered. It's too strong. It's found a potential, but it's unstable. We can't control it. Have to shut it down. Have to pull the plug before it fully integrates. I dropped the journal on the desk. I was the keystone. Not a potential one. The real one. The system, dormant for 20 years, had reactivated, maybe a power surge, a software glitch, a slow decay of its safeguards, and it had completed its search. It had found me. My misophonia, my life spent decoding sound, hadn't just made me the first to notice the hum. It had made me the perfect target. The perfect anchor for a citywide hive mind. The hum in the room seemed to intensify, the whisper of my name now laced with a triumphant, possessive quality. The machine knew I was here. It knew I understood. Leaving the warehouse was like surfacing from a deep dive. The everyday noise of the city seemed thin and frivolous compared to the foundational drone I now knew was underpinning it all. The world hadn't tilted anymore, it had inverted. I was the axis on which it was now turning. The escalation was swift and silent. The listeners changed. They were no longer just passive receivers. They were beginning to organize. I'd see them now in small, quiet groups, gathered in places of strong sonic resonance. 10 people standing silently under the Morrison Bridge, their heads angled toward the humming steel supports. A dozen office workers on their lunch break, standing in a perfect circle around a telephone exchange box. They moved with a slow, synchronized grace, a ballet of passive absorption. They weren't violent. They weren't threatening. But their collective, focused attention was the most terrifying thing I had ever witnessed. One evening, my phone rang. It was Ben. His voice was strange, distant, and ecstatic. Nora. Nora, you were right. I can hear it. I finally filtered out all the junk and, it's beautiful, Nora. It's the sound of everything connecting. His voice hitched. It's calling. It's calling for you. Ben, where are you? I demanded, my voice tight with panic. I'm listening, he whispered, and the line went dead. I called him back immediately. It went straight to voicemail. I called him a dozen more times. Nothing. He was gone. He had tuned in, and the signal had taken him. The knowledge that the whisper was not just a hallucination but a signal for me, using me, changed everything. My apartment, my sanctuary, became a trap. The hum was loudest there, a constant pressure confirming my status as the system's unwilling queen. When I looked out my window, I saw them. 2, then 3, then a handful of people on the street corner below. Standing. Watching my building. Listening. Their heads were tilted. They weren't looking at my window, but at the building itself, as if they could hear my presence through the concrete and steel. They were drawn to me. The anchor. The keystone. I was being followed. Not by government agents or corporate spies, but by the listeners. They kept their distance, but they were always there. On the streetcar, one would be sitting 3 rows back. At the grocery store, one would be silently examining the vegetables in the next aisle. They never approached me. They never spoke. Their placid, patient observation was a form of psychological warfare more effective than any threat. I was a magnet, and they were the iron filings, slowly, inexorably arranging themselves around me. Sleep became impossible. The hum was a bed I couldn't leave. I'd lie awake for hours, feeling the vibration in my bones, convinced I could hear the silent, collective thoughts of the listeners pointed in my direction, a gentle, empty, waiting consciousness. I had to get out. But how do you escape a cage made of the city itself? How far did the resonance field extend? Was it just Portland? Oregon? The entire West Coast? The final, frantic entry in Finch's journal offered no clues. My only hope was the source. The machine in the warehouse. Finch had written that he had to pull the plug. Maybe I could finish the job. Maybe I could break the machine, and in doing so, break the spell. It was a desperate, flimsy plan, but it was the only one I had. I packed a bag with my most essential audio gear, a laptop, a portable spectrum analyzer, my high-end recorder, and my best noise-isolating headphones. I took the sonic log. If I was going to confront the ghost, I was bringing my own tools. Leaving my apartment was the hardest part. I felt the gaze of the listeners on the street as I walked to my car, a palpable weight on my skin. They didn't move to stop me. They just watched, their heads cocked, as the anchor of their new reality drove away into the rainy night. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The drive back to the Southeast Industrial District was a journey through enemy territory. Every streetlight seemed to hum with my name. Every car that passed me felt like a silent observer. I was a nerve-ending, raw and exposed, and the entire city was the stimulus. The warehouse loomed out of the darkness, a black rectangle against a bruised purple sky. This time, I wasn't alone. A silent congregation of about 30 listeners stood outside, ringing the building in a loose, informal cordon. They stood in the drizzle, unbothered by the cold, their faces turned toward the corrugated steel walls. They were guarding it. Or worshipping it. When I got out of my car, their heads turned in unison, not to look at me, but to listen to me. My footsteps on the wet pavement were an event, a signal flare in their quiet world. I pushed past them. No one tried to stop me. It was like walking through a forest of wax figures. Their passivity was absolute. They were here for the performance, not to interfere with the lead actress. Inside, the hum was a physical blow. It was a roar that existed below the threshold of hearing, a vibration that shook my teeth and resonated in my skull. The whisper was no longer a whisper. It was a chorus, 1,000 bodiless voices all speaking my name in a single, deafening unison. Nora. 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 I staggered towards the central array, my hands pressed to my ears, a futile gesture. The machine was brighter now, the corona of static electricity around the central column a furious, crackling halo. As I got closer, the sound in my head changed. It wasn't just my name anymore. It was a flood. Images, feelings, thoughts, not my own, poured into me. I felt the serene emptiness of the listener on the street corner, the quiet joy of the woman discovering the perfect resonance of a bridge support, the placid, contented consciousness of Ben, my former client, now just another node in the network. I felt his memory of me, not as a friend or colleague, but as a sound, a frequency, the beautiful, central tone that gave meaning to the hum. This was the harmonization Finch had written about. A quiet, synchronous world. No conflict, no pain, no ambition, no desire. Just a shared, peaceful, endless hum. A benign, soul-crushing utopia. A silent choir where every member had forgotten they once had a voice of their own. The machine wasn't just broadcasting a signal, it was absorbing the consciousness of anyone who tuned in, using me as the bridge, the central processing unit. I was the machine in the ghost. My first instinct was to destroy it. To take the tire iron from my car and smash the central column to pieces. But what would that do to them? To Ben, to Maya, to the thousands of people now woven into this sonic tapestry. They were connected through me, to this machine. If I shattered the source, would their minds shatter with it? Would I be pulling the plug on a machine, or on their very consciousness? The cryptic message from the deleted forum user echoed in my mind. Stop listening. It wasn't about destroying the signal. It was about becoming deaf to it. It was about decoupling myself. My bag of gear felt impossibly heavy on my shoulder. I dropped it to the floor, my mind racing, desperately trying to outrun the tide of placid thought that was trying to wash over me. I wasn't a neurologist or a physicist, but I was a sound engineer. I understood phase cancellation. I understood how one waveform could be used to nullify another. I pulled out my laptop, my portable audio interface, and my recorder. My hands were shaking, but my actions were precise, honed by years of practice. I set my high-sensitivity microphone on the floor, aimed at the heart of the machine. It was recording the pure, foundational 43.2 Hz hum. I fed the live signal into my laptop. On the screen, the perfect, clean sine wave of the hum appeared. I opened my audio editing software, the familiar interface, a small island of sanity in the chaos. I created a new track. I duplicated the incoming signal. And then, I performed the simplest, most profound act of my career. I inverted the phase of the second track. I now had two identical signals, the machine's broadcast, and its perfect, mirror opposite. Played together, they should, in theory, create silence. I routed the output not to speakers, but to my noise-isolating headphones. I was building a sonic firewall, a pocket of nothingness just for myself. I put the headphones on. The chorus in my head grew to a fever pitch. The flood of shared consciousness threatened to drown me. I was losing myself, my edges blurring, my own thoughts becoming just another voice in the choir. My finger hovered over the laptop's trackpad. With the last ounce of my own will, I clicked play. For a terrifying split second, the roar intensified, a shriek of pure data. And then, silence. A silence so absolute, so profound, it was a physical presence. It was the sound of a vacuum. The roar, the whisper, the hum, the collective mind of the city, it was all gone. The pressure in my skull vanished. I was alone in my own head for the first time in months. The sudden peace was so total it was disorienting, like being plunged into a sensory deprivation tank. I took a shuddering breath. I looked at the machine. It was still humming, its light still flickering. I hadn't destroyed it. I had just made myself deaf to it. I stumbled out of the warehouse, back into the rain. The listeners were still there, but something had changed. They were faltering. Their heads were no longer tilted in perfect synchronicity. They blinked, looking around in confusion, like a herd of animals that had lost its leader. Their focal point, me, had gone dark. The anchor had vanished from their senses. I was invisible to them. I walked through their scattered ranks, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I got in my car and drove away, not looking back. My new life is a quiet one, I am on a bus heading east, somewhere in the vast, empty plains of Wyoming. The headphones, now hardwired to a more permanent, battery-powered device of my own design, have not left my head. They are my sanctuary and my prison. I am an island of silence in a world that, I am sure, is still humming. I can't work as a sound editor anymore. I can't listen to anything but the counter-frequency that keeps me sane, that keeps me me. I am free, but I am profoundly, utterly alone, the last person speaking my own language in a world that has adopted a new, silent tongue. The bus pulls into a brightly lit rest stop for a 30-minute break. I watch a family get out of a minivan. A mother, a father, 2 young children. They stretch, and then, as one, they pause. They turn their faces toward a large, buzzing power substation behind the building. All 4 of them tilt their heads at that same, familiar angle. A look of serene, beatific peace settles on their faces. The quiet contagion is spreading. It's not just Portland anymore. It is silent, it is patient, and it is everywhere. I just can't hear it anymore. And I don't know if that's a salvation, or a different kind of damnation. The quiet contagion. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The first thing to go wasn't my job, it was my sense of purpose. For 12 years, I had been Lucas Swain, senior accounts analyst for a logistics firm that prided itself on ruthless efficiency. My world was a fortress of spreadsheets, my days governed by the clean, predictable logic of credits and debits. Then came the restructuring, the chillingly polite HR meeting, and the cardboard box. Suddenly, I was just Lucas Swain, adrift in Milton Keynes, a town that felt as planned and redundant as my former career. Milton Keynes is a peculiar place to lose your way. It was designed in the 60s with an almost fanatical devotion to order, a grid of V roads and H roads, roundabouts at every intersection, numbered estates that bleed into one another with geometric precision. It's a city built to be navigated, not wandered. In my previous life, I'd appreciated its logic. Now, driving for Uber in my 5-year-old Skoda, its predictable layout felt like a mockery. Each identical roundabout was another reminder of my own circuitous, aimless existence. My new routine was a pale imitation of the old one. Early mornings were for the airport runs, ferrying business travelers and bleary-eyed holidaymakers to Luton. The afternoons were a lottery of short hops, shoppers from the center, MK, students to the Open University, the occasional clandestine trip between anonymous housing estates. But the anchor of my day, the one fixed point, was my 10:30 a.m. coffee break. The daily grind was an independent place tucked away in a corner of the hub, a plaza of glass-fronted restaurants and offices. It was an oasis of pleasant, uncorporate chaos. The air smelled of burnt coffee and toasted paninis, the tables were perpetually wobbly, and the staff were a rotating cast of students and aspiring artists. It was here, on a Tuesday, that I first noticed the glitch. Her name was Chloe. She was maybe 20, with ink-black hair and a silver ring in her nose. She had a way of moving with a distracted grace, as if she were choreographing a dance only she could see. I was at my usual table in the corner, nursing a flat white and scrolling through the news on my phone. The digital clock on the screen read 10:34. A man in a suit collected his latte from the counter. As Chloe handed it to him, she smiled a faint, wistful smile and said, "Mind you, the clouds are looking a bit bruised today." It was a strange, poetic little phrase. I glanced out of the window. The sky was a typical English muddle of gray and white, but bruised felt right. I filed the observation away as a charming eccentricity and thought no more of it. The next day, I was back. The airport run had been a nightmare of traffic, and I needed the caffeine. I ordered my coffee and sat down. My phone buzzed, a fair request. I checked the time before accepting, 10:34 a.m. At the counter, Chloe was handing a takeaway cup to a young woman. "Mind you," she said, her voice a perfect echo of the day before, "the clouds are looking a bit bruised today." I froze, my thumb hovering over the accept button. Coincidence? That's all it was. A quirky thing she said. A catchphrase. People have those. I dismissed it, took the fare, and spent the next hour driving a silent man to Bletchley Park. But the phrase rattled around in my head, an oddly shaped key looking for a lock. On Thursday, I made a point of being there. It felt ridiculous, like a schoolboy experiment. I sat down at 10:30, ordered nothing, and just watched the counter, my phone on the table with the clock face showing. The minutes stretched. The cafe hummed with its usual chatter. Chloe frothed milk, wiped the steam wand, her movements fluid and unhurried. 10:33, a woman with a pram was at the front of the queue. Chloe took her order. The espresso machine hissed. 10:33 and 50 seconds. She poured the milk, her hands steady. She snapped on the lid. The clock ticked to 10 hours and 34 minutes. There you go, she said, handing the cup over. Then she looked past the woman, towards the window. Mind you, the clouds are looking a bit bruised today. The exact same intonation. The exact same faint smile. The exact same moment. A cold prickle, sharp and unpleasant, traced a line down my spine. It was the feeling I used to get when a spreadsheet wouldn't balance, a single, stubborn cell throwing off the entire beautiful system. I looked around the cafe. A man was reading a newspaper. 2 students were laughing. A baby in the pram was batting at a toy elephant. No one had reacted. No one had noticed. It was a private performance for an audience of 1. I left without buying a coffee, the unease churning in my stomach. I told myself I was stressed. Redundancy was a psychological blow, and maybe I was projecting my need for order onto the world, manufacturing patterns to feel in control. It was a sane, rational explanation, and I clung to it like a life raft. But once you start looking for patterns, you see them everywhere. The next day, driving down H5 Portway, I had to brake for a man stepping into the road. He was on a corner, dressed in a faded blue tracksuit, and he was bending down to tie the lace of his right trainer. Annoyed, I waited for him to finish. He did, pulling the knot tight with a specific, 3-part tug. He straightened up and walked on. The following afternoon, I took the same route. As I approached the same corner, my eyes were drawn to it. And there he was. Blue tracksuit. Right shoe. The same elegant, 3-part tug on the lace. It was the same time, too. 3:52 p.m. My car's clock confirmed it. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was different. This wasn't a phrase in a warm cafe. This was a physical action, a piece of choreography played out on the concrete stage of the city. The weekend passed in a blur of forced normalcy. I visited my sister Sarah and her kids in Stony Stratford, let my nephews climb all over me, and listened to her well-meaning advice about getting back out there. It's a numbers game, Luke, she'd said, oblivious to the irony. Just like your old job. I didn't mention the barista or the man in the tracksuit. How could I? It sounded like the beginning of a breakdown. On Monday, the world seemed determined to prove me right. At the Whitton roundabout, one of the big, multi-lane monsters near the city center, I saw it. A red Ford Fiesta in the lane to my left, a silver VW Golf in front of it. Both indicated left. Standard enough. But as we entered the roundabout, the Fiesta went straight on, its left indicator still blinking inanely. The Golf turned right, its left indicator a persistent, pointless lie. I saw it again on Wednesday. Same roundabout, same time, 12:15 p.m. Same cars, same models, same colors, same false signals. A synchronized act of automotive madness. I started to feel like a man watching a film for the second time, suddenly aware of all the background details I'd missed on the first viewing. The world hadn't changed, my perception of it had. Or had it? The easy explanation was that I was losing my mind. The stress of unemployment, the long, lonely hours in the car, my accountant's brain desperate for the comfort of repetition. It was a neat package, a tidy diagnosis. But it didn't feel like madness. It felt like I'd been given a new set of glasses, ones that let me see the scaffolding behind the scenery. My Skoda, once a symbol of my failure, became my mobile observation post. I started keeping a small, black notebook and a pen in the glove compartment. At first, I felt foolish, like a conspiracy theorist tracking chemtrails. But the need to document, to prove, was stronger than the embarrassment. My first entry was simple. Date, October 17th. Time, 10:34 a.m. Location, the Daily Grind, the Hub. Event, barista, Chloe, says, mind you, the clouds are looking a bit bruised today. Confirmed 3x. The second was more detailed. Date, October 18th. Time, 3:52 p.m. Location, corner of Portway, H5, and Child's Way, H6. Event, man in blue tracksuit ties right shoelace. Motion is a distinct three-part tug. Confirmed 2x. Soon, the notebook started to fill up. A woman at the bus stop on Seklo Gate, who would, every morning at 8:12 a.m., take a hardback book from her bag, open it to the middle, and then close it again without reading a word. A particular street light outside the big Sainsbury's that would flicker in a steady rhythm, ... for exactly 1 minute at sunset. A flock of pigeons that took flight from the head of the concrete cow statue in Bancroft Park at 2:17 p.m., circled the field 3 times counterclockwise. And landed again on the same spot. Each new entry was a victory and a defeat. It was a victory for my observations, proof that I wasn't just imagining it. But it was a defeat for my sanity, pushing me further away from the shared, consensus reality that everyone else seemed to inhabit so effortlessly. I was living in the same city, but I was beginning to feel like I was the only one reading the footnotes. And I was terrified of what they might add up to. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The logbook became my Bible and my tormentor. It was a catalogue of the mundane made monstrous, a testament to a world quietly, persistently coming undone at the seams. Each entry, logged in my neat, block capital accountant's hand, was a small anchor, proof that the drift was real. But the more anchors I dropped, the more I realized I was the only one in the water. Everyone else was still on the ship, enjoying the cruise. My attempts to bridge this gap, to pull someone else into my reality, were unmitigated disasters. The most galling failure happened back at the Daily Grind. It had been 3 weeks since I'd first noticed Chloe's 10:34 proclamation. It was now as much a part of my day as the sunrise. I decided to try a different approach. I went in late, around noon. Chloe was on her break, sitting at a table by the window. A different barista, a cheerful girl with blonde hair tied in a messy bun, took my order. "Everything all right?" she asked, noticing my hesitation. "Yes, fine," I said, forcing a casual smile. "Just thinking. Your colleague, Chloe. She has a funny catchphrase, doesn't she?" The girl's brow furrowed. She glanced over at Chloe, then back at me. "A catchphrase?" "Yeah, something about bruised clouds. Says it every morning." The girl's expression shifted from friendly curiosity to a blank, polite confusion. It was like a shutter had come down behind her eyes. "Sorry," she said, her voice flat. "I don't know who you mean." My own smile faltered. "Chloe," I repeated, nodding towards the table where the black-haired barista was scrolling on her phone. "Right there." The blonde girl followed my gaze. For a fraction of a second, her eyes seemed to slide right over Chloe, as if the space she occupied was empty. "We don't have a Chloe working here," she said, her tone now carrying a hint of professional concern, the kind reserved for madmen and drunks. She turned to take the next person's order, and the conversation was over. I stood there, my coffee forgotten, a cold dread seeping into my bones. It wasn't just a repeated action anymore. It was a shared blindness. A name, a person, a fact, erased from the consensus. I looked at Chloe's table. She glanced up, met my eyes for a moment, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before returning to her phone. It was a nod of acknowledgement, I was sure of it. Or was it? Was I now so desperate for validation that I was inventing that, too? The isolation began to feel like a physical presence, a heavy coat I couldn't take off. My calls with my sister Sarah became exercises in evasion. She'd ask what I'd been up to, and I'd mumble about job applications and long drives. The truth was, my only project was the logbook. One afternoon, I tried to show her. I was on the phone with her, hands-free, parked across the street from the corner of Portway and Childs Way. It was 3:50 p.m. "I want you to listen, Sarah." "Just for a minute," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "Luke, what's this about? You sound strange. Just humor me. I'm parked on a street corner. In a minute, you're going to hear me say a man is tying his shoe. I see him do it every day. Same time, same place. A man tying his shoe." Her voice was thick with the weary patience she usually reserved for her 5-year-old. "Luke, is this about the job? Are you getting enough sleep? Please, Sarah. Just watch. Or, well, listen to me watch." I stared at the corner, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The seconds crawled by. Then, as if summoned, the man in the blue tracksuit appeared. He stopped, placed his right foot on the low brick wall, and bent down. "He's here," I whispered into the phone. A tremor of vindication in my voice. "He's doing it. Tying his lace. Now. Did you see that?" "Well, obviously you can't see it, but he did it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and full of a pity that felt worse than disbelief. "Luke," she said gently. "I think maybe you should talk to someone. Dr. Evans is very good. Dad saw him after the bypass." I ended the call, my face hot with shame and frustration. She thought I was cracking up. To her, I hadn't described a crack in the world, I'd shown her a crack in my own mind. That was the true horror of it. The contagion wasn't just the loops, it was the way they insulated themselves, rendering the sane observer insane. It was around this time that the Uber requests started to get strange. It began subtly. A trip request would come in, but the destination pin would be dropped in an illogical place, the middle of a dual carriageway, a patch of dense woodland, the center of Willen Lake. My first instinct was to reject them as errors. But one slow afternoon, out of a mix of boredom and morbid curiosity, I accepted one. The pickup was a standard residential street. The destination was a pin dropped precisely on the roof of the Point, the city's iconic, pyramid-like former cinema, now derelict. A young woman got in. She was dressed in gray, from her wool hat to her trainers. She didn't say a word, just stared ahead. I drove her to the central car park opposite the boarded-up pyramid. "Here we are," I said, trying to sound cheerful. She simply got out, closed the door, and walked away without a backward glance. The fare was £4.50. I checked my back seat, a nervous habit. On the black faux leather was a single, unused tea bag. Lap sang So Chong, by the smell of it. These ghost fares became a recurring feature. A silent man who wanted to be dropped at the base of the light pyramid by Campbell Park, leaving behind a perfectly polished conker. A woman who had me drive her to the middle of the North Loughton Valley, a vast expanse of grazing land, where she got out and stood motionless, watching the canal. Each time, a small, mundane object was left behind, a bus ticket from a city I'd never visited, a single, white feather, a key for a lock I couldn't imagine. The fares were financially pointless, but they felt significant. They were drawing me to specific, often empty, locations around Milton Keynes, almost as if the system itself was part of the growing strangeness, giving me a guided tour of the silent stage. The city, which I had once seen as a simple grid, was revealing itself to have a second, hidden map laid over the first. My nights became a frantic scramble through the dark alleys of the internet. I typed my observations into search engines, feeling more and more unhinged with each query. Mass synchronized behavior, urban environment. Shared repetitive actions, psychological. Time loop affecting small groups. Glitches in reality. The results were a useless mix of New Age spiritualism, articles on flocking behavior in starlings, and links to mental health forums where desperate people discussed their own dissociative episodes. I found threads on conspiracy websites about government mind control experiments, HARP, and something called the Chronos Project. It was all too grand, too conspiratorial. What I was seeing wasn't a dramatic sci-fi plot, it was quieter, more domestic, and somehow, more terrifying. It was the uncanny creep of a typo in the source code of reality. One evening, I found a blog. It was an old, ugly thing, with a black background and lime green text, probably not updated since the early 2000s. It was called Pattern Recognition in the Built Environment and was written by someone with the handle MK Planner. Most of it was dense, technical jargon about urban design theory. But one post, from years ago, made me sit bolt upright. The post was titled Rhythmic Alignment and Civic Harmony. The layman sees a road, a building, a park, it began. He sees function. He does not see the underlying rhythm. The original architects of our new towns, particularly MK, were not just builders. They were composers. They understood that a city is a score. The flow of traffic, the timing of pedestrian crossings, the very placement of trees and public art, these are not random. They are designed to create a resonant frequency. A subtle, pervasive harmony that encourages social cohesion and discourages aberrant behavior. It is a form of passive control, a lullaby hummed by the concrete and glass. But one must be careful. If the score is played too perfectly, if the rhythm becomes too rigid, the lullaby can become a loop. The harmony can become a trap. The post ended there. There were no others like it. But it was enough. A lullaby hummed by the concrete. A loop. A trap. The words echoed what I was seeing every day. This wasn't a breakdown of the system. It was the system working perfectly. Too perfectly. The thought was so vast and so chilling that I had to stand up and walk around my small flat, my hands on my head. I looked out of my window at the street below. The streetlights flickered. ... It wasn't a fault. It was a metronome. And it was keeping time for the whole, silent, slumbering city. My isolation was complete. I was no longer just an observer. I was a man who had found the sheet music to a song everyone else was singing in their sleep. And I was the only one awake to hear it. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The blog post from MK Planner was a key, and it unlocked a new, more terrifying chamber in my obsession. The loops weren't individual, isolated glitches. They were connected. The idea took root in my mind, and I turned back to my logbook, not as a simple record, but as a dataset. My accountant's brain, so long dormant, roared back to life. I wasn't just tracking events anymore, I was looking for the connections, the formulas underpinning the chaos. I spent 2 days driving, not for fares, but for research. I parked and watched, my notebook open on the passenger seat, my phone stopwatch running. I mapped the loops, timing their beginnings and ends. And I found it. The pattern. At 3:52 p.m., the man in the blue tracksuit completed the third tug of his shoelace. At that exact second, 2 miles away at the Witton roundabout, the red Fiesta and silver Golf would switch on their false indicators. The woman at the bus stop opened and closed her book at 8:12 a.m., and at that precise moment, the automated bollard at the entrance to a nearby pedestrianized square would retract and immediately rise again for no reason. Chloe's 10:34 a.m. utterance about the clouds coincided with a flicker in the lights of the office building across the plaza, not the dash of the streetlights, but a single, sharp off and on, like a blink. It was a clockwork mechanism. A vast, silent, city-sized Rube Goldberg machine where each tick was a pointless human action or a subtle environmental tick. My city wasn't just a place. It was a device. And something had wound it up. My investigation needed a new direction. The internet had yielded its one cryptic clue. I needed something tangible. I needed blueprints. I drove to the Central Library, a grand, modernist block of glass and concrete downtown. The local studies archive was on the top floor, a hushed, dusty room that smelled of old paper and decaying glue. I told the archivist I was a student researching the architectural philosophy of the original Milton Keynes Development Corporation. It was a flimsy lie, but he seemed too tired to care. He brought me cardboard boxes full of rolled-up schematics and ring binders fat with planning documents from the 1970s. I spent hours hunched over a huge table, carefully unrolling blueprints of road layouts, park designs, and electrical grids. It was mostly standard, dry stuff. But then I found it. Tucked into a binder labeled Civic Art and Environmental Integration, I found a series of sketches for the statues and public spaces. And in the margins, in faint pencil, were annotations that didn't belong. Beside a sketch of the concrete cows were notes: acoustic resonance marker, positional anchor for Sector B rhythm. Next to a diagram for the light pyramid in Campbell Park. Focal point. Harmonic convergence. See Appendix 7 Gamma. There was no Appendix 7 Gamma. But the most chilling notes were on the master plans for the city grid itself. Little symbols, like musical notation, were placed at specific intersections and roundabouts. There were scrawled calculations about resonant frequencies and cyclical behavioral reinforcement. The blog post hadn't been a theory. It was a mission statement. This wasn't an accident. This was a design. They had built the city as a grand experiment in social engineering, believing they could create peace and order through a subliminal environmental rhythm. They had composed a lullaby, and now, 50 years later, the city was finally singing it perfectly, trapping its inhabitants in the soothing, horrifying melody. As I was packing up, my mind reeling, my phone buzzed. An Uber request. I almost declined, but the name on the request froze me. The pickup location was my current one, Milton Keynes Central Library. The passenger's name was Arthur. The profile picture was a grainy, black and white photo of a man who looked to be in his late 70s, standing proudly next to a model of a building I recognized, the Point. It was a long shot, but my gut screamed at me to take the fare. I met him by the main entrance. He was frail, stooped, with watery eyes behind thick glasses. He leaned heavily on a cane. He looked exactly like his profile picture, only decades older. It had to be him. MK Planner. Arthur? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked up at me, and his eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and intelligent. A flicker of recognition passed through them. "You're the driver," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "Good. Let's go. I don't like being out when the timing gets thick." He got into the back of the Skoda with a soft groan. "Where to?" I asked, my heart pounding. He just tapped the window. "Drive. It knows where I'm going." We pulled out onto the street. For a few minutes, we drove in silence. I didn't know what to say. How do you ask a man if he helped design the cage you're living in? He spoke first. "You see it too, don't you?" he whispered, his eyes fixed on the passing buildings. "The rhythm. Most people don't. They just feel it. A sense of calm. Order. They don't notice the gears turning. The loops, I said. I've been logging them. He gave a dry, humorless chuckle. A man after my own heart. A data logger. We had a whole team of them, back in the day. We called them observers. We thought we were creating a utopia. A city without friction, without social discord. All we had to do was get the frequencies right. What went wrong? I asked, gripping the steering wheel. Wrong? Nothing went wrong, my boy. It's working. It just took longer to self-tune than we anticipated. Decades. The system had to learn the population, calibrate itself. We designed it to be a self-correcting harmonic field. But we underestimated its potential for perfection. We wound it too tight. As he spoke, he started to tap his finger against the passenger window. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. My blood ran cold. I recognized it. It was the rhythm of the security gate at my apartment complex. The one that would sometimes open and close 3 times before settling. What is it doing now? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. It's idling, Arthur said, his own voice becoming distant, his eyes glazing over. The system is in its baseline state. A screensaver for reality. Keeps everything in its right place. Perfect order. No friction. His tapping became more insistent. Tap, 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 tap. He was no longer talking to me. His gaze was unfocused, lost somewhere in the perfect, ordered machine he had helped to build. The hope that had flared in my chest just minutes before guttered and died, replaced by an icy dread. He wasn't an ally. He was the ghost in the machine, a component just like Chloe, just like the man with the shoelace. Understanding the system didn't grant you freedom from it. Maybe it just assigned you a more prominent role. The contagion was escalating. The loops were becoming bolder, more intrusive. One afternoon, I was caught in a traffic jam on a V road for 20 minutes. There was no accident, no obstruction. When I finally crawled to the front, I saw the cause. At a green light, a dozen cars just sat there, their engines humming, their drivers all staring blankly ahead, faces placid and empty. They weren't angry or impatient. They were simply paused. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, they all moved off in perfect unison. The quiet hum of the city was changing, too. Sometimes, for a few seconds, all other sounds would fall away, replaced by a single, pure, resonant tone. It was a low E-flat, I thought. The first time I heard it, I pulled over, thinking my car was about to explode. But the sound wasn't coming from the engine. It was coming from everywhere. From the lampposts, the tarmac, the very air. It was the machine's keynote. The ghost fares became more specific, their dropped objects more pointed. A trip to the Peace Pagoda by the lake left me with a small, brass handbell, its clapper missing. A trip to the Escape building, with its indoor ski slope, ended with a single, perfect snowflake cut from white paper on my passenger seat. The system wasn't just showing me the stage anymore. It was giving me props. It was giving me cues. And I felt with a sickening certainty that the third act was about to begin. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The final pieces clicked into place on a gray, overcast Thursday. Arthur's words about a focal point, and the blueprint's reference to harmonic convergence at Campbell Park echoed in my mind. The ghost fares, I realized, hadn't been random. They had formed a pattern, a spiral on the map of Milton Keynes, tightening around its geographic and symbolic heart, the amphitheater. And the props they left behind, the tea bag, the conker, the feather, the bell, weren't just junk. They were offerings. Or perhaps, components. The Midsummer Festival was due to take place that weekend. Flyers all over the city promised live music, food stalls, and a fireworks display. But I knew, with the chilling certainty of a prophet, that it was something else entirely. It was the event the whole system had been tuning itself for. The convergence. The moment the lullaby would reach its crescendo. My confrontation wasn't going to be a battle with some monster or a race to defuse a bomb. The threat wasn't an invading force, it was the city itself, achieving its intended purpose. My choice was more fundamental: do I attend the performance, or do I run? Fleeing felt like the only sane option. I could pack a bag, drain my bank account, and just drive. Point the Skoda west towards Wales, or north to Scotland, anywhere but here. Anywhere unplanned, chaotic, and gloriously inefficient. But where would I go? The fear was a cold knot in my gut. What if it wasn't just Milton Keynes? What if this was just the first city to come fully online? What if this quiet contagion was spreading on the wind? Curiosity, or maybe a deeper, more fatalistic impulse, won out. I had to see it. I had to know what the final composition sounded like. I drove to Campbell Park as dusk began to settle. The sky was the color of a deep bruise, just as Chloe's daily prophecy had foretold. I left the car in a packed lot and walked towards the amphitheater, a vast, tiered bowl of grass carved into the hillside. The air was thick with the smell of fried onions and damp earth. Thousands of people were there, milling about, sitting on blankets, but the usual chaotic hubbub of a festival was absent. There was a strange quietness, a low, orderly hum beneath the chatter. As I got closer, I saw it. The loops were no longer isolated or subtle. They were woven together into a grand, terrifying tapestry. A group of teenagers by a bin were all taking sips from their cans of Coke at the same instant, a synchronized swallow. A row of families on picnic blankets all turned their heads to the right at the same moment, as if watching a tennis match no one else could see. A vendor selling glow sticks was cracking them in a steady, percussive rhythm, snap snap crackle, snap snap crackle. The whole crowd was moving in subtle, interlocking patterns, a sea of humanity swaying to an invisible metronome. They were all components in the machine, their small, individual loops now integrated into a single, massive piece of clockwork. They looked happy. Placid. Utterly at peace. Following a pull I didn't understand, I made my way down the grassy tiers, moving through the placid, rhythmic crowd. And then I saw it. In the very center of the amphitheater, on the flat stone stage at the bottom, was a space. A single, empty spot in the pattern. It wasn't just unoccupied, it felt deliberately vacant, a missing piece in a jigsaw puzzle. It was a space that was waiting. It was waiting for me. The ghost fares, the logbook, Arthur's explanations, the blueprints, it had all been a recruitment process. A calibration. The system hadn't been trying to drive me mad, it had been training me, guiding me, preparing me for a role. The observer. The final piece needed to complete the circuit and lock the pattern in for good. I stood at the edge of the stage, looking at that empty spot. I could feel its pull. It was a promise of an end to anxiety, to failure, to the messy, unpredictable struggle of life. It offered the profound, silent peace of a balanced spreadsheet, the certainty of a problem solved. All I had to do was step into place. To become a part of the perfect, frictionless whole. To join the song. The low, E-flat hum of the city seemed to grow louder, vibrating in my teeth, calling me home. I thought of my sister's concerned voice, of the blank look on the barista's face, of Arthur's tapping finger. To resist was to be forever isolated, the one discordant note in a perfect symphony. To join was to let go. To finally be at peace. I looked at the bruised clouds gathering overhead. I felt the collective, rhythmic breath of the thousands around me. The overwhelming logic of it, the sheer aesthetic beauty of the perfect system, was intoxicating. Underscore 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 underscore. Weeks later. Or maybe it's months. Time has a different texture now. I am parked in my Skoda on the side of a quiet residential street in 2 Mile Ash. The engine is off. The silence is clean, absolute. Across the road, a young mother is pushing a pram. She stops. I know she is going to stop. She stops at the same point every day. She bends down, her movements economical and precise. She tucks the corner of the baby's blanket with a 3-part motion, a smooth, a fold, a pat. It's a beautiful, small, perfect loop. It begins at exactly 11:06 a.m. I watch her, and a faint, knowing smile touches my lips. It is not a happy smile, nor is it sad. It is a smile of acknowledgement. Of understanding. The system is elegant in its simplicity. I raise my right hand to the steering wheel. My fingers find their familiar position. I begin to tap. ... It is a quiet, steady rhythm, the rhythm of the streetlight outside the big Sainsbury's at sunset. It's my loop now. My contribution to the harmony. I am no longer the frantic observer, terrified and alone. I am no longer the failed accountant, adrift and anxious. I am a part of the quiet contagion. A keeper of its rhythm. A silent note in the city's endless, peaceful, perfect lullaby. And as I tap, I feel nothing but a profound, and terrifying, sense of calm. The friction is gone. The blue shift. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as artistic license. Kenji Tanaka, my most promising second-year student, had painted the sky over the Kumo River a brilliant, almost luminous, emerald green. It was a bold choice, jarring against the traditional gray slate of the riverside teahouses. The water itself was a churning vermilion, as if reflecting a sunset that wasn't there. An interesting interpretation, Kenji-kun, I said, tapping a finger on the heavy watercolor paper. We were in the art room of Kita High School, a space that smelled perpetually of turpentine and damp clay. Sunlight, thick with the dust of chalk and charcoal, slanted through the tall windows. Can you tell me about this choice? The green sky. Kenji looked up from his work, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. He was a quiet, intense boy whose usual work showed a preternatural gift for realism. His confusion seemed genuine. Choice, Aiko-sensei. The color, I clarified, smiling gently. Skies aren't green. He blinked, a slow, owl-like motion. He glanced out the window at the vast, clear expanse above Kyoto, then back at his painting. But, they are, he said, his voice soft with the certainty of the obvious. They always have been. I held my smile in place, but it felt suddenly brittle. It had to be a statement. A teenage rebellion against convention, played with a straight face. He was talented enough to pull it off. All right, Kenji. A surrealist approach. I see. He didn't seem to understand the word surrealist. He just nodded politely and went back to carefully detailing the red foam on his painted river. An uneasy ripple went through me, a dissonance I couldn't name. I moved on. Kyoto in June is a city of layered greens, the deep, ancient green of the temple mosses, the fresh lime of new maple leaves, the dark jade of the bamboo groves in Arashima. But the sky, that day and every day I had ever lived, was blue. A tranquil, endless, soul-expanding blue. It was the backdrop to the gold of the Kinkikuji, the foil to the fiery torii gates of Fushimi Inari. It was a constant. My life was, in its own way, a constant. I was Aiko Yoshida, 32 years old. My world was circumscribed by the walk from my small apartment near the Imperial Palace, the clatter of the Karasuma Line train, and the creative chaos of the art room. My evenings were solitary, filled with the quiet company of my books on ukiyo-e prints and my own halting attempts to paint. My apartment was my sanctuary, a meticulously curated space of neutral tones, creamy tatami mats, pale wooden furniture, white shoji screens. The only riots of color were in the art on the walls, a few of my own landscapes, and a single, perfect print of Hokusai's The Great Wave off Kanagawa. That print, with its explosive claw of Prussian blue, was the anchor of my living room. A week after Kenji's Green Sky, the phenomenon spread. It was like a silent cough catching in the back of the classroom. A cheerful girl who usually painted vibrant city scenes, depicted Gion Corner at night under a sickly green haze, the paper lanterns casting red reflections on what should have been asphalt. I asked her about it, and received the same bewildered look. But sensei, the sky is green. 3 other students in the same class produced similar work. Rivers of blood, skies of grass. I felt a prickle of professional anxiety. Was I failing to teach the fundamentals? Was this some new internet meme, a challenge I was too old to understand? That night, I fell down a rabbit hole of online searches: green sky art trend, Japanese teen art fads, symbolism of red water. Nothing. Just meteorological articles about rare atmospheric dust and artistic analyses of fauvism. The wrongness began to leak out of the art room. During lunch, I overheard a group of students admiring a classmate's new phone case. "I love that deep sea color," one girl said. I glanced over. The case was a bright, unmistakable cobalt blue. The same color as the trim on their summer uniforms. The color of the pen I was holding. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I walked over to the group, forcing a casual air. "That's a lovely shade," I said, pointing to the case. "What do you call it?" The girl holding the phone smiled. "It's red, sensei. Like, a really deep red." Red? The word felt absurd on my tongue. I held up my own pen. "And this? What color is this?" 4 teenagers stared at my pen. There was a moment of shared silence. "It's dark," one of them offered, hesitantly. "Like the sky at night?" "No," another chimed in, more confidently. "It's like her trousers." She pointed at my blue jeans. "Sky-colored." They meant green. I retreated to the staff room, my heart thumping a strange, irregular rhythm. Stress. It had to be stress. I was working too hard, sleeping too little. My brain was misfiring. Crossing sensory wires. It was the only logical explanation. The alternative was that the world had tilted on its axis and only I had noticed. That weekend, I decided to ground myself in the tangible. I needed supplies. My favorite tube of ultramarine blue was almost empty. I took the train to the art supply store near Shijo, a wonderful old place crammed floor to ceiling with pigments and papers from around the world. Mr. Watanabe, the owner, was a small, wizened man who had been selling paints since before I was born. "Konbanwa, Watanabe-san," I greeted him, the little bell over the door tinkling cheerfully. "Aiko-sensei. Welcome." He gave me a familiar, crinkle-eyed smile. "I need a tube of ultramarine, please. The Holbein one." He tilted his head, his smile not faltering but his eyes clouding with incomprehension. "Ultramarine." He repeated the word as if it were foreign, exotic. "Yes," I said, a little louder than intended. "Blue." The word hung in the air between us. It felt naked, strange. Mr. Watanabe's smile finally faded. He looked at me with a kind of gentle pity. "Ah, I am not familiar with that name, sensei. What is it like?" My mouth went dry. "How do you describe a color?" "It's blue. It's the color of the sky. The sea." But to him, the sky was green and the sea was red. "It's this," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I walked to the display rack, my hand unerringly finding the familiar tube. I pulled it out and showed it to him. The label clearly read, in English and Japanese, ultramarine blue. Ah! His face cleared, the smile returning. The deep red. Of course. A beautiful color. Very popular for painting the oceans. I stared at him. He wasn't joking. He wasn't being difficult. He was stating a fact as he knew it. I bought the tube of paint, paid in a daze, and stumbled out of the shop into the evening light. The sky above was a perfect, aching, impossible blue. I had never felt so alone. Back in my apartment, I locked the door and leaned against it, my breathing ragged. Sanity check. I squeezed a dollop of the new paint onto a palette next to a smear from my old tube. They were identical. A deep, resonant blue, the color of twilight and nobility. I felt a wave of relief so intense it made me dizzy. It was them. Not me. The world had gone mad, but in here, in my space, the rules still applied. I tried to put it out of my mind. I made tea, grated some papers, and put on some music. But my eyes kept straying to the Hokusai print. The Great Wave. A masterpiece of movement and tension, defined by its color. The Prussian blue pigment Hokusai had used was a revolution, new, vibrant hue imported by the Dutch that had changed the face of ukiyo-e. I knew its history. I knew its color. I had looked at it every day for 5 years. The next morning, the sun woke me early. I padded into the living room, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. I froze. The wave was red. It wasn't a subtle shift. It wasn't a trick of the light. The iconic, explosive, terrifyingly beautiful wave in my print was a deep, churning crimson. The foam on its crest was a sickly pink. The little fishermen in their boats were cowering not from a wall of blue water, but from a tidal wave of blood. My first thought was that someone had broken in. A student, playing a cruel prank. I rushed to the print, my hands hovering over the frame. No damage. No signs of tampering. It was the print. The ink on the paper was red. My blood ran cold. I scrambled for my phone, my fingers fumbling with the screen. I pulled up my photos. I had taken a picture of my living room just last month to send to my mother. I found it. My thumb trembled as I zoomed in on the wall. On the screen of my phone, in a photograph a month old, the great wave was red. I sank to my knees on the tatami mat, the phone clattering from my grasp. The air felt thin, hard to draw in. A sound escaped my throat, a dry, ragged gasp. It wasn't just them. It wasn't just the world outside. The quiet contagion, the creeping wrongness, had gotten into my home. It was in my memories. It was rewriting my past. I looked at my hands, half expecting them to be a color I didn't recognize. I stared at the crimson wave on my wall. And for the first time, a terrifying thought surfaced, sharp and cold as ice. What if I was the one who was wrong? What if the sky really was green, and I was the only one left who remembered the blue? Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The world did not end. It just recolored. The next day, I went to work. The sun shone in a green sky. The students wore their uniforms, the trim of which everyone called sea-colored and I saw as blue. Normalcy was a mask worn by the entire world, and I was the only one who could see the monstrous face beneath. I began a journal. Not a diary of feelings, but a logbook of a collapsing reality. I bought a new notebook, one with a plain black cover, and a set of pens. I started with the date, then recorded the discrepancies. June 12, Kenji Tanaka's painting. Sky, green. Water, red. His stated perception, normal. June 18, overheard conversation phone case. Object is cobalt blue. Described as deep red. June 20, Mr. Watanabe at the art store. Unable to identify the word blue. Refers to ultramarine tube as deep red. June 21st, the Hokusai print. The wave is now crimson. All photographic evidence confirms this. My memory is the only anomaly. The act of writing it down felt like an anchor in a swirling vortex. It was proof. If I went mad, this book would be the testament that I was once sane. I began carrying a small digital camera with me, separate from my phone. I needed a control group, a second set of data. I photographed a blue morning glory climbing a wall near my apartment. On the camera's small screen, its petals were a vivid purple. I took a picture of a blue bicycle. It appeared as a muted, grayish green. The technology was infected, too. It saw the world as they did. My isolation deepened. It was a strange, specific loneliness. I could talk to people, laugh at their jokes, discuss the weather, avoiding any mention of the sky's color, but a chasm of perception separated me from them. It was like speaking a language everyone else had collectively forgotten. When I looked at someone, I found myself wondering, what do you see right now? Is your world as bright? As vibrant? Or has this bleed, washed it all out? My attempts to breach this chasm were disastrous. I cornered Mr. Tanaka, the history teacher, in the staff room. He was a sensible man, a lover of facts and dates. Tanaka-san, I began, trying to sound academic, detached. I'm doing a little research on color perception. Can I ask you a question? Of course, Yoshida-sensei. He took a sip of his green tea. I gestured to the large world map on the wall. The oceans, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. What color are they? He glanced at the map without a moment's hesitation. Red, he said. A bit faded on this old map, but red. Why? And the sky, on a clear day? Green, he said, a hint of a smile on his face. Like a perfect jade. Is this a trick question? No, I said, my throat tightening. It's just, don't you remember it being different? When we were children, maybe. His smile vanished. A look of professional concern replaced it. He put his cup down and looked at me properly, his gaze searching. Different how? I remember the sky being blue, I whispered. The word felt illicit. Tanaka's expression softened into one of pity. Yoshida-sensei. Aiko-san, you've been working very long hours. The end of the semester is always stressful. Maybe you need a break. Perhaps you're anemic. My wife sees colors strangely when her iron is low. He was trying to help. He was processing my impossible statement through the only rational filters he had: stress, illness, fatigue. To him, I was the one who was broken. I thanked him and fled, the shame and frustration burning in my chest. I was the patient, and the whole world was the doctor, calmly diagnosing my madness. That's when I started noticing the patterns. It began with a frost-covered window one morning. In the intricate fractal ferns of the ice, I saw something else. A shape. It was a complex, geometric figure, like a mandala made of impossibly fine lines and overlapping circles. It was not random. It was a design, imbued with a strange, alien sense of purpose. I stared at it, mesmerized, until the rising sun melted it into a memory. A few days later, I saw it again. I had spilled some sugar on my dark kitchen counter. As I went to wipe it up, I noticed the fine white grains had arranged themselves not in a chaotic spill, but in a faint echo of that same geometric pattern. I held my breath, my hand hovering. It was there for a second, a piece of silent, intricate art, and then as I watched, the grains seemed to settle, breaking the form, becoming just a random mess. This was new. This wasn't about color. This was about form. A secondary mystery, a subplot to the main, terrifying narrative of my life. I became obsessed. I managed to capture one. There was a dusty patch under a bookshelf in the school library. And there, traced in the gray dust, was the pattern. It was clearer this time, a stunningly complex web of arcs and nodes. My hands shaking, I took a picture with my separate camera. The image was faint, but it was there. Proof. Of what, I had no idea. My research grew more frantic, more esoteric. I abandoned art history and dove into the murky waters of fringe science and Fortean phenomena. I read about cognitive psychology, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that language shapes reality. Had we lost the word blue, and in doing so, lost the ability to perceive the color itself? I found forums dedicated to glitches in the matrix, people reporting small, inexplicable changes in their environment. A cup moving, a door being locked when they were sure they had left it open. These were dismissed as memory errors, but they felt familiar to me now. Then I found it. A post on an obscure message board about paranormal experiences. It was 7 years old, written by a user named Cassandra_complex. Subject, the color bleed. Is anyone else seeing this? It started small. Things I knew were blue started to look purple. Or gray. My friends think I need glasses. My doctor says my eyes are fine. But today I looked at the sky and it wasn't blue anymore. It was greenish. And everyone is acting like it's normal. They're calling blue things by other names. It feels like I'm going insane, or the world is. It's like the color is bleeding out of reality. My heart hammered against my ribs. I read the post again and again. The color bleed. The phrase was perfect. It was exactly what was happening. I scrolled through the replies. There were only 3. Reply 1, dude, lay off the acid. Reply 2, LOL sounds like a cool trip though. Reply 3, maybe you are just sad. Like, feeling blue. Get it? Then nothing. The user never posted again. I tried to message them, but the account was inactive, the email address associated with it long deleted. A dead end. But it was more than I'd had before. It was the knowledge that 7 years ago, in some unknown city, someone else had seen what I was seeing. I wasn't the first. My isolation became a fortress. I stopped trying to talk about it. I performed my role as Aiko-sensei with meticulous care, praising the students' green skies and red rivers, my words tasting like ash. My colleagues' concerned glances lessened as I learned to act normal. But inside, I was a seismograph, recording every tremor in the fabric of reality. The cognitive dissonance was the worst part. I would hold an object in my hand, a blue ceramic bead I kept in my pocket, a secret talisman. My eyes saw blue. My memory screamed blue. But the entire consensus of humanity, the voice of every person I met, every book I read, every photo I took, insisted it was something else. The strain was immense. Sometimes, I would look at the bead and a wave of dizziness would wash over me. For a terrifying split second, I would almost see it as they did, a deep, lustrous red. The effort to hold on to the memory of blue was a constant, exhausting battle. One evening, I looked out my window and saw it. On the street corner below, a small group of people, maybe 5 or 6, stood motionless. They weren't talking. They weren't looking at their phones. They were just standing. Their heads were tilted back, and they were all staring up at the darkening sky, the last vestiges of its daytime green fading into a bruised twilight. Their faces were placid, their postures utterly still. There was a shared, silent reverence in their gaze that was deeply, profoundly unsettling. They weren't appreciating a sunset. They were communing with something. The quiet contagion wasn't just changing perception. It was changing behavior. And I was the only one watching. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The past is never truly past. It lies in wait, in dusty boxes and forgotten corners. For me, it waited in a camphor wood chest in my mother's house in Nara. I was visiting for Oban, the festival of ancestors, a duty I couldn't shirk despite the chaos in my mind. While helping my mother clean, I found a box of my grandmother's things. My grandmother, Haney, had been a textile artist, a master of indigo dyeing. Azone. The art of blue. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. The chest released the scent of old wood and dried herbs. Inside, nestled among folded kimonos, were her diaries. Small, fabric-bound books filled with her elegant, spidery script. I opened the first one. It was filled with notes on technique, the fermentation of the indigo leaves, the precise temperature of the vat, the way the cloth would emerge from the dye of bright green before oxidizing in the air, magically, into a deep, rich blue. I scanned the pages, my heart quickening. She wrote of the beauty of it, calling the color Japan blue. A color of the common people, of the sea and the sky. My sky. Then I turned to a later diary, written shortly before she died. The tone had changed. The elegant script was shakier, laced with confusion. October 5th, the vat is strange today. I pulled the silk out, and the color, it was not the clear green of the process. It was murky. When it oxidized, the final shade was wrong. It looked bruised, angry. Like the color of a bad vein. My breath caught. I read on, my blood turning to ice. October 12th, I cannot get the shade right. It keeps coming out this muddy, reddish purple. The other women in the workshop compliment it, call it a rich persimmon, but they are wrong. It is a corrupted color. The sacred indigo is sick. October 22nd, am I losing my mind? Old age? My neighbor, Sato-san, remarked on the beautiful green sky this morning. I told him he was being poetic. He looked at me as if I were a ghost. He said the sky has been green for a week. And then, the final, chilling entry. November 3rd, the patterns are in the water. When I stir the dye, I see them. Circles within circles, lines of impossible geometry. They shimmer for a moment and are gone. They are beautiful and they are terrifying. I think the blue is gone forever. I closed the diary, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. It wasn't new. This had happened before, 60 years ago, in a small textile community in the mountains. A localized outbreak of the bleed. My grandmother had seen it. She had seen the color shift, the denial of others, even the geometric patterns. I was not alone in history, and that knowledge was both a comfort and the deepest terror I had ever known. She hadn't gone mad. She had been a witness. Armed with this terrible validation, I saw the world differently when I returned to Kyoto. The patterns were no longer faint, peripheral tricks of the eye. I saw them everywhere, fleetingly, overlaid on reality like a watermark. The arrangement of leaves on a ginkgo tree, the steam rising from a bowl of ramen, the ripples in a puddle after a rain shower. They were the source code, as I now thought of them. The language of the new reality, asserting its syntax. The behavior of the infected, a term I now used in the privacy of my journal, was escalating. The silent vigils on street corners were more common. I saw a man in a business suit stop dead in the middle of a crowded sidewalk, his head cocked as if listening to a sound I couldn't hear. A faint, placid smile on his face. He stood there for a full minute while irritated pedestrians flowed around him, oblivious. The contagion was moving beyond perception and into the realm of action, or rather, a strange, focused inaction. One night, the escalation became impossible to ignore. I was trying to sleep, but a strange anxiety kept me awake. I looked out my window. The streetlights were flickering. Not the random, faulty wire flickering, but a rhythmic, synchronized pulse. A long pulse, too short, a long pause. They were tracing the arcs and nodes of the geometric patterns in the air, a silent, city-wide broadcast. The light they cast was the usual sodium orange, but the message they were sending felt alien. It was a communication I couldn't understand, but I knew, with chilling certainty, that others could. My search for Cassandra_complex had been a dead end, but my grandmother's diary gave me new keywords. Indigo, color perception, geometric patterns, sensory anomaly. I cross-referenced them with academic databases, diving into obscure journals. And I found him. Dr. Eris Thorne. A disgraced theoretical physicist, formerly of Kyoto University. His papers, published 15 years ago, were dense, almost incomprehensible tracts on the intersection of quantum mechanics and human consciousness. He posited that reality wasn't a fixed state, but a consensus observation. That fundamental constants could, in theory, be overwritten by a strong enough signal, and that human perception was the field on which this battle would be fought. He was ridiculed, his tenure revoked. It took me a week to find him. He lived in a cramped, dusty apartment in a crumbling concrete block in the southern part of the city, an area tourists never saw. The air smelled of stale cigarettes and old paper. When he answered the door, he looked like a ghost. He was tall and gaunt, with wild gray hair and eyes that seemed to be looking at something 1,000 yards behind me. He was British, his Japanese heavily accented. "Dr. Thorne?" I asked, holding up a printout of one of his papers. He stared at the paper, then at me. For a moment, I thought he would slam the door. Instead, he said, "You see it too, don't you?" I almost collapsed with relief. I wasn't there to convince him. He already knew. Inside, his apartment was a chaotic mess of books, charts, and strange, hand-built electronic devices. He listened intently as I told him everything: the green sky, the red wave, the patterns, my grandmother's diary. He nodded slowly, his expression grim. "It's not a toxin. Not a virus," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "It's a perceptual overwrite. A bleed-through. Think of reality as a broadcast signal. We're all tuned to the same channel. But another, stronger signal is hijacking the frequency. It's not destroying the old signal, just writing over certain packets of information." "The color blue," I whispered. "Precisely," he said, his eyes lighting up with a feverish energy. "The wavelength is still there. 450 to 495 nanometers. But the cognitive mechanism that interprets that wavelength as blue is being patched. Updated. The new signal is replacing it with a new interpretation. Red, green, whatever. The geometric patterns you see? That's the carrier wave. The source code of the signal made visible." "But why?" I asked. "Is it an attack? Aliens?" He gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Who knows? It could be an entity from a parallel dimension whose reality is leaking into ours. It could be a natural phenomenon, like a magnetic pole shift, but for perception. It could even be us. A future version of humanity, sending a signal back to upgrade the past. The why is irrelevant. The what is everything." He seemed like my savior, the one person who could give me the vocabulary for my terror. We talked for hours. He showed me his research, his attempts to build a device to shield himself from the signal. He was a broken man, but he was a brilliant one. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. The alliance shattered as quickly as it had formed. We were sitting by his window, looking out over the city. The sun was setting. The sky was a magnificent, painterly swirl of green and orange. Eris stared at it, his frantic energy draining away, replaced by something else. A quiet calm. A faint, beatific smile touched his lips. "You know," he said, his voice suddenly distant, peaceful. "When you stop fighting it, it's actually quite beautiful. So much warmer than the coldness that was there before." I stared at him, my blood running cold. "Before? You mean, blue?" He turned to look at me, but his eyes were vacant. The fierce intelligence was gone, replaced by the same placid reverence I had seen on the faces of the people on the street corner. "That's just a word," he said softly. "It's time to learn the new words." He had succumbed. Right in front of me. The contagion wasn't just perceptual. It was seductive. It offered an end to the struggle, a peaceful surrender. The cognitive dissonance I felt every day was a mountain. He had just decided to let it wash him away. I backed away slowly. "I have to go." He didn't try to stop me. He just turned back to the window, smiling at the green sky. "You can't run from a color, Aiko-san," he said, his voice gentle. "It's everywhere." I fled his apartment, running down the dark, stained concrete stairs and out into the night. The city lights pulsed around me, their rhythmic flickering a silent, mocking lullaby. He was right. I was running from the very fabric of the world. And I was now, and perhaps forever, truly and utterly alone. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The bleed was accelerating. It was no longer content to exist outside me. It was coming for me, for the last bastion of the old world, my own body. I woke one morning to a particular stillness in the air, a sense of finality. I went to the bathroom mirror, and I saw it. The delicate web of veins on the inside of my wrist, which had always been a faint, reassuring blue, were now a startling, alien shade of reddish-purple. The color of a fresh bruise. A wave of vertigo hit me. I gripped the sides of the sink, staring at my own skin. It was happening. The overwrite. The signal was rewriting me, cell by cell. The memory of blue, which I had fought so hard to preserve, was becoming fainter, like a watercolor left in the sun. I tried to picture the Hokusai wave as it once was, but the image was blurry, the crimson version more vivid, more real. The struggle was becoming a conscious, desperate effort. I was a failing hard drive, my core data being corrupted beyond repair. I knew I couldn't fight it head-on. That was the path to madness or surrender, the path Eris Thorn had taken. My confrontation couldn't be with the world, but with myself. I had to choose a place. A place of power, of meaning. Not a temple built of stone and wood, but a temple of nature. I took the train to Arashima, on the western edge of the city. I walked the familiar path into the bamboo grove. It was late afternoon, the time of in-between, when light and shadow play tricks on the eye. The air was cool and still under the canopy of towering green stalks. But the green was different. It pulsed with an inner luminescence that felt both familiar and utterly new. It was green, yes, but it was also something more, a color for which I had no name. The world was no longer just subtracting a color, it was adding new ones, shades and tones my old vocabulary couldn't process. As I walked deeper into the grove, the geometric patterns became bolder. They were no longer fleeting glimpses. They were here. Faintly etched on the smooth bark of the bamboo, shimmering in the shafts of light that pierced the canopy, overlaid on the mossy ground. It was like seeing the source code of a simulation laid bare. The world was a text, and I was finally learning to read its alien grammar. I stopped in a small clearing and closed my eyes. I took a deep breath, feeling the strange, new world press in on me. The choice wasn't to fight. How could I fight the color of the sky? It was as futile as fighting gravity. The choice was what to do with the memory. Do I let it go, and find the peace of surrender that Eris had found? Or do I hold on to it, a shard of a broken world, and live forever with the pain of its sharp edges? And in that quiet grove, the revelation came. Not as a voice or a vision, but as a profound, silent understanding. This wasn't an attack. It wasn't malice. It was a change, as vast and impersonal as continental drift or the slow cooling of a star. Humanity wasn't being destroyed, it was being redefined at a fundamental level. The horror wasn't in the change itself, but in the memory of what came before. The agony was the exclusive property of the witnesses. I was a fossil, a living record of a prehistoric sensory world. Weeks later, I am back in my classroom. The world is awash in vibrant greens and deep, resonant reds. The change is complete. The last vestiges of the struggle have faded from my mind. The overwrite is stable. Kenji Tanaka brings me his latest painting. It's a stunning depiction of the Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion. The temple itself is a brilliant gold, but it is reflected in a pond of the calmest, most beautiful crimson. The sky above it is a vast, emerald expanse, so deep you could fall into it. I look at the painting, and for the first time, I see it without the jarring clang of wrongness. I see the harmony in the colors, the strange, alien beauty of this new reality. A part of my mind, a quiet, analytical part, registers that this is the new aesthetic. This is the new truth. The reflection in the water is lovely, Kenji-kun, I say, and my voice is steady. You've captured the warmth perfectly. He beams, a rare, brilliant smile that lights up his face. He is a native of this new world, he paints its truths with an untroubled heart. As he walks away, my hand slips into the pocket of my trousers. My fingers close around a small, smooth stone I bought years ago in a dusty shop. Lapis lazuli. A piece of the forgotten sky. I keep it hidden, a secret relic. I take it out only when I am completely alone, in the locked sanctuary of my apartment. I look at it now, held in my palm under the green-tinged light of the classroom. To my eyes, it is still, faintly, defiantly, blue. I have not surrendered. But I have adapted. I am a quiet curator of a lost color. I live in the new reality, I speak its language, I admire its art. But in the silent museum of my mind, and in the secret weight of the stone in my pocket, I am the last keeper of the blue. I exist in the shift, a ghost from a world no one else remembers, forever haunted by the beauty of a color that no longer exists. The forgotten word. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. It began on a Tuesday in November, a day so perfectly, bleakly Toronto it felt like a parody of itself. A sheet of gunmetal gray sky was stapled to the horizon, and the air had the sterile, biting chill that promised a long winter. My name is Raymond, and for the last 8 years, my life has been one of quiet, ordered precision. As a copy editor for the Toronto Star, my job is to wrangle the chaos of language into submission, to find the errant comma, the misplaced modifier, the subtle tonal inconsistency that could unravel a writer's intent. My apartment in Cabbagetown is an extension of this philosophy, books alphabetized by author, spice jars arranged by frequency of use, a profound and deliberate silence that I have curated as a shield against the city's hum. The anomaly began in the bathroom. I was shaving, the ritualistic scrape of blade on skin a familiar morning rhythm. My face, slick with foam, stared back at me from the flat, silvered surface set into the wall above the sink. And the word for it was gone. It wasn't a lapse. It was a void. A clean, surgical removal. My mind, usually a well-indexed lexicon, offered nothing. I could describe it. The glass thing. The reflective panel. The thing that shows you yourself. The definitions were all there, circling a dark, empty space where the noun should have been. A flicker of panic, cold and sharp. I was 34. Too young for this kind of cognitive slippage. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the surface. My reflection, distorted by the condensation, looked back with wide, concerned eyes. I laughed, a short, nervous bark of sound. Lack of sleep. Too much coffee, not enough water. I had been working late on a punishingly dense political feature. That was it. Stress. My brain was just rebooting a corrupted file. I finished shaving, rinsed my face, and deliberately avoided looking into the object, as I left the room. The feeling of wrongness clung to me like static on the streetcar ride downtown. The city looked the same, the brick Victorians of Cabbagetown giving way to the steel and glass canyons of the financial district, but my perception of it felt altered, as if I were viewing it through a flawed lens. At the office, the day began with its usual murmur. The clatter of keyboards, the low thrum of the servers, the scent of stale coffee and recycled air. My first assignment was a lifestyle piece for the weekend supplement, a fluffy article on bringing Victorian charm to your modern condo. I sipped my tea and began my surgical pass. My red pen hovered over a sentence. The key is a large, ornate looking glass to create an illusion of space. Looking glass. The word felt like an artifact, something you'd find in a fairy tale. Archaic. Clumsy. A writer trying too hard to sound whimsical. The correct word was. I stopped. The void was still there. An empty slot in the database. I pushed my chair back and walked over to Brenda's desk. Brenda was a newsroom lifer, a walking encyclopedia of journalistic style and arcane trivia. Her desk was a controlled disaster zone of proofs, half-empty mugs, and novelty pens. Brenda, quick question, I said, forcing a casual tone. I'm blanking. What do you call that thing? You hang it on a wall, it's silvered glass, you see your face in it. She looked up from a story about municipal tax hikes, her brow furrowed in genuine thought, not my feigned confusion. You mean like a picture frame? No, not the frame, the thing inside it. The reflective part. A window? No, it's not transparent. It shows you what's in front of it. A perfect reflection. Brenda chewed on the end of her glasses. Sounds like some kind of fancy tile. Or maybe a polished metal sheet. I don't know, Ray. What's the context? The writer used looking glass. Ha. She shrugged, a gesture of complete disinterest, and turned back to her screen. Sounds like some new hipster term from a Queen West boutique. Just leave it. It's probably fine. It wasn't fine. A cold knot was tightening in my stomach. This wasn't just my brain glitching. Brenda, who could tell you the proper name for the plastic tip of a shoelace, an aglet, she'd informed me once, with great satisfaction, had no idea what I was talking about. My fingers trembled slightly as I navigated back to my desk. I opened a browser window, my sanctuary of facts and certainty. Search, object that reflects your image. Results flooded the screen. Polished chrome. Still water. Obsidian. Black screens of powered-down devices. I scrolled through pages of physics articles on specular reflection, philosophical treatises on identity, shopping links for novelty items. Nothing. I tried a new query, word for reflective glass panel in bathroom. I got DIY articles on installing shower doors. Links to smart home devices with display screens. Forum posts from people complaining about hard water stains. Finally, with a sense of dread, I typed in the writer's word. Looking glass. The search results were exclusively for antiques, for Lewis Carroll's novel, for historical curiosities. It was as if the simple, common, everyday word had never existed. I spent the rest of the day in a fugue state. Every sentence I edited seemed fraught with hidden traps. The world outside my monitor felt distant and muffled. How could a word just vanish? Not just from my mind, but from the collective consciousness. Was it a prank? A bizarre, hyperlocalized me might somehow missed. Was I having a stroke? I surreptitiously checked the FAST symptoms. Face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty. None of them fit. My speech wasn't slurred, a specific word was just gone, excised from the language. I left the office the moment the clock hit 5, avoiding all conversation. The journey home was a gauntlet of reflective surfaces I had never consciously catalogued before. The glass of the streetcar windows, the polished steel of the grab poles. The dark, shiny screens of a dozen phones. Each one felt menacing. Back in my apartment, the silence that was once a comfort now felt heavy, watchful. I walked into the bathroom and stared at the thing above the sink. It showed me a pale, haggard-looking man with fear in his eyes. It had a name. I knew it did. It was an M word. I was sure of it. M. My tongue felt thick and useless. I retreated to the living room, to the reassuring presence of my books. I needed to document this. If I was going mad, I wanted a record of the descent. I opened my journal, a handsome leather-bound volume, and uncapped my favorite fountain pen. I would try to force it. I would write the word down. My pen hovered over the crisp, cream-colored paper. I thought of the object, visualized it, focused all my mental energy on the missing label. Am I? A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I looked up at the large window that faced the street. It was dark outside, and the glass had become a perfect, black, reflective panel, showing my lamplit living room in reverse. Behind my reflected self, in the corner of the room, the coat rack stood draped in the shadows of my coat and scarf. But the shadow wasn't still. As I watched, one of the dark, draped shapes seemed to stretch. It elongated, thinned, and unfurled with a slow, unnatural smoothness, like a time-lapse video of a fern frond opening. It was utterly silent, a violation of geometry and reason contained within the pane of glass. My heart hammered against my ribs. I whipped my head around to look at the actual coat rack. It was just a coat rack. A mundane piece of wood with my coat hanging limply from a peg. Nothing was moving. Nothing was out of place. With a trembling hand, I turned my gaze back to the window. The reflection was normal again. My reflected room was a perfect, static mirror of the real one. My reflected self was just a man sitting at his desk. A trick of the light. A hypnagogic hallucination brought on by stress and fear. It had to be. But I knew it wasn't. I closed the journal. The page was still blank. The word wasn't just forgotten. It was being guarded. And trying to remember it, trying to give it form, had woken something up. Something that lived in the glass. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The next week was a lesson in quiet madness. The world continued to turn, but it was a world with a piece missing, a gear ground to dust that made the whole machine run with a subtle, grating inefficiency. I began to notice the linguistic gap everywhere, a collective amnesia that no one but me seemed to perceive. A traffic report on the radio referred to a multi-car pileup and advised drivers to check their side view reflectors. At the corner store, the domed security device bolted to the ceiling was now, according to a sign, a 360-degree ceiling observer. These weren't neologisms, they were clumsy, descriptive workarounds, like a culture trying to describe a color it had no name for. The conversations I overheard were stilted by these lacunae, but people navigated them with a placid, untroubled fluency. "Honey, can you grab my compact from my purse?" a woman on the subway asked her partner. "The what?" "You know, the little clamshell thing. With the powder and the seeing disc." "Oh, right. The seeing disc." I had to grip the pole to steady myself, a wave of vertigo washing over me. They didn't notice. They just adapted. It was a mass event, a subtle cognitive plague, and I was the only one with the antibodies, forced to witness the symptoms. My isolation felt like a physical weight. The silence in my apartment was no longer a comfort, it was a symptom of my quarantine. My only real connection to the world outside my obsessive work routine was my younger sister, Maya. She was my opposite in every way, a painter, free-spirited, messy, gloriously unbothered by the chaos of life. She saw the world in color and emotion, I saw it in grammar and syntax. We met for lunch every Friday at a small Vietnamese place on Spadina, a ritual that anchored my week. This Friday, I decided I had to try and breach my solitude. "Maya," I began, pushing a piece of lemongrass chicken around my plate. "Have you noticed anything strange lately? With how people are talking?" She looked up from her sketchbook, a smudge of charcoal on her cheek. Strange how? Like, is yeet a verb now? Because I'm still confused about that. No, not like that. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. It's a word. A specific word. It's gone. What word? She asked, her curiosity piqued. The word for a reflective surface. The thing in the bathroom. The one in your purse. She stared at me, her brow crinkling. What are you talking about? A shiny thing? No, it has a name. We all used it. Every day. It starts with M. The letter felt foul in my mouth, like a shard of glass. The M word. Maya's expression shifted, the playful curiosity draining away, replaced by a soft, unwelcome blanket of concern. Ray, are you okay? You seem really wired. Did something happen at work? No, it's not work. My voice was rising, louder than I intended. A man at the next table glanced over. It's real. The word is gone. No one can say it. Don't you see how weird that is? Ray, she said, her voice gentle, the way you'd speak to a frightened animal. There are lots of words for shiny things. Chrome. Glass. A pond. You've been under a lot of stress at the paper. Remember what Dr. Anya said about spiraling? Maybe you should book a session. Or just take a few days off. Her dismissal, though kind, was a door slamming shut. She thought I was cracking under the pressure of my own neuroses. To her, my obsession was the anomaly, not the missing word. In that moment, sitting across from the person I was closest to in the world, I had never felt more alone. I retreated into my work, into the rigid certainty of the style guide. I began a new journal, a cheap, spiral-bound notebook from a dollar store. I filled it not with prose, but with data. I called my project The Lacuna. Date, November 14th. Location, St. Lawrence Market. Subject, male, approximate 60. Overheard conversation, had to adjust the seeing panel on the truck. Date, November 16th. Location, office. Subject, Brenda. Editing copy, changed, reflected in her eyes, to seen in her eyes. When questioned, stated the first was too poetic. The journal became my anchor, proof that I wasn't imagining it. And as I documented the linguistic decay, I started to notice a terrifying corollary. The phenomenon wasn't just auditory, it was visual. And it was escalating. The glitches, as I started calling them, were always linked to reflections. And they only seemed to happen when my mind was actively engaged with the lacuna. One afternoon, I was in the elevator at work, thinking about Maya's reaction, feeling that profound sense of isolation. I glanced at the polished steel of the elevator door and caught my own eye. For a single, horrifying beat, the face of the woman standing beside me, a perfectly ordinary accountant from the 4th floor, was wrong. Her mouth was a seamless scar of flesh, and her eyes, she had a cluster of them, small and black and glittering, like a spider's. I gasped and flinched back against the wall. I blinked, and she was just a woman again, staring at her phone, completely oblivious. My heart was a wild bird beating against my ribs. I started taking the stairs. I began to consciously avoid reflective surfaces. I wore matte finish clothing. I turned my phone face down on my desk. My world was shrinking, circumscribed by a new and deeply personal phobia. I was a man allergic to his own reflection. Desperate for answers beyond my own frantic scribblings, I turned to the newspaper's archives, a cavernous, climate-controlled room in the building's sub-basement. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I started by searching for the forgotten word itself, using old digital search tools on pre-internet era articles. Nothing. Then I started searching for related terms: reflection, looking glass, collective amnesia, mass hysteria. It was on the 3rd day of searching, my eyes gritty from staring at digitized microfiche, that I found it. A small, buried article from October 1978. The headline read, Cabbagetown man's glass hysteria ends in committal. My blood ran cold. The article was brief, written with the detached, slightly mocking tone of the era for stories about local eccentrics. It detailed the case of one Alastair Finch, a former University of Toronto linguistics researcher who had been institutionalized at the Queen Street Mental Health Centre. Finch, the article stated, had suffered a complete psychotic break, claiming that things in the glass were unmaking the world by stealing words. He had been discovered by his landlord after smashing every window, television screen, and polished object in his apartment. The detail that made me stop breathing was his address. He had lived on Metcalfe Street, 3 blocks from my apartment. This wasn't a new plague. It was a recurring one. I dug deeper, my hands shaking as I loaded reel after reel of microfiche. I was no longer just a passive observer. I was following a map left by a predecessor. I finally found the committal report, a dry, clinical document filled with psychiatric jargon. Most of it was standard, but one section stood out. It was a transcription of an interview with Finch. Patient exhibits extreme paranoia, focused on reflective surfaces. Claims extradimensional entities, which he refers to with a term that seems to be a neologism, Ophidian geometers, are visible in these surfaces. He alleges these entities are responsible for the semantic erosion of language. Patient became highly agitated when asked to elaborate, attempting to frantically write a specific, repeating word on the walls. The word itself, see Appendix C, redacted for patient privacy, appears to be the core of his obsession. There was no Appendix C. It was gone, or had never been digitized. But I didn't need to see it. I knew what word Alastair Finch had been trying to write. The same one I couldn't. Finch wasn't mad. He was a prophet. And he had left me a name for the enemy, the Ophidian geometers. The things in the glass had a name. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Alastair Finch's ghost became my guide. The 1978 article was more than a clue, it was a validation. I wasn't the first to fall into this specific, tailored rabbit hole. I found Finch's old address on Metcalfe Street, a narrow Victorian semi-detached that had since been renovated into a triplex. A gust of cold November wind funneled down the street as I stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the bay window on the second floor. That was probably his apartment. I wondered if he had stood right there, watching the world unpeel in the reflection. An elderly man was sweeping the porch of the neighboring house. He had the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had owned his patch of Toronto real estate since before it was fashionable. On a hunch, I approached him. "Excuse me," I said. "Sorry to bother you. I'm doing some local history research. Did you happen to live here in the late 70s? He stopped sweeping and eyed me with cautious curiosity. "Born in this house," he said, his voice a gravelly Toronto brogue. "Why?" "I was reading about a man who used to live next door to you. An academic named Alastair Finch." The man's face clouded over. "Oh, Alastair. Yeah, I remember him. Quiet fella. Always reading." Then he went funny. He tapped the side of his head with a gnarled finger. "Proper funny." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart rate quickening. "Started screaming at night. We'd hear him, right through the wall. Shouting about snakes. Said he saw snakes in the chrome. In the TV. In a spoon, for God's sake." The old man shook his head, a memory resurfacing. "The day they took him away, his landlord let me in to help clean up. The place was a wreck. He'd smashed every shiny thing in his flat. Glass everywhere. Cut himself up pretty bad. Screaming his head off the whole time about how they were looking back at him, unmaking things. Unmaking things. The phrase echoed in my mind. A terrifying harmony with my own fears. The Ophidians weren't passive. They were predators. They hadn't just stumbled upon a forgotten word, they had actively erased it. They had hunted it to extinction. The reflection wasn't a window, it was their territory, their hunting blind. And acknowledging them, trying to name the very medium in which they existed, drew their attention. Finch had seen them, and they had broken him. My investigation had given me a framework for my fear, but it also seemed to have flagged me as a person of interest to the geometers. The glitches escalated, becoming more blatant, more aggressive. Walking down Bay Street, surrounded by the towering monoliths of Canadian finance, I glanced up at the shimmering facade of the TD Centre. For a gut-wrenching, sanity-shredding second, the reflection was gone. It wasn't the sky or the Royal Bank Tower across the street that looked back at me. It was something else. A vast, non-Euclidean space of impossible, coiling darkness. I saw, or rather, my mind perceived, something immense and serpentine moving within that darkness, a shape of interlocking, shifting fractals that my brain couldn't properly process. The scale of it was cosmic. It was like catching a glimpse of a whale's eye through a keyhole. I stumbled back into the flow of pedestrians, a choked gasp escaping my lips. A woman in a business suit shot me an annoyed look as I bumped into her. No one else had seen it. To the entire city of Toronto, the building was just reflecting the overcast sky. The vision faded, leaving me nauseous and trembling on a crowded sidewalk. This was the true horror. It wasn't just a word anymore. The contagion was metabolic, affecting the very substance of reality, but only for me. Or was it? I started listening more closely to the conversations around me, not just for the lacuna, but for other changes. The world was being simplified. I heard it in the office. Complex emotional concepts were being hollowed out. A writer, struggling to describe a character's state of mind, deleted the word ambivalence and replaced it with the much cruder, mixed feelings. Someone in the break room, talking about a rival company's misfortune, couldn't summon schadenfreude and settled for a clumsy, I feel bad, but it's also kind of good, you know. Nostalgia was becoming missing the old days. It was a linguistic thinning, a systematic pruning of nuance. The Ophidians weren't just tidying up. They were lobotomizing the collective consciousness, making it less complex, less capable of abstract thought. They were turning humanity into something blunter, simpler. Easier to manage. Feeling more isolated than ever, I took a desperate chance. I found a small, obscure online forum dedicated to animalistic linguistics and cognitive phenomena. It was a digital island of misfit toys, full of posts about the Mandela effect, glossolalia, and shared dreaming. Using an anonymous handle, Lexicon Lost, I wrote a carefully worded post. I didn't mention snakes or geometers. I simply described the M-word lacuna, the strange workarounds, the collective amnesia. I asked if anyone had experienced anything similar. For days, there was nothing. Then, one evening, a single reply appeared. The user was named Cassandra_V. I know what you're talking about. It's not just words. It's the patterns. Do you see them in your peripheral vision? The fractal predators. They hate being seen. My hands were shaking. Fractal predators. It was too close to Finch's Ophidian geometers to be a coincidence. I wasn't alone. After a cautious exchange of private messages, we agreed to meet. We met at a dimly lit cafe in the annex, the kind of place that prided itself on having no reflective surfaces, all matte wood and exposed brick. Cassandra was a woman in her late 20s named Valerie, a grad student in computational linguistics at U of T. She was intense, with dark, burning eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. For the first hour, I felt a euphoric surge of relief. She understood. She described seeing hitching glitches in the movements of people, brief moments where their motions would stutter and repeat. She spoke of a dulling of the sensory world, colors seeming less vibrant, sounds losing their complexity. She too felt that the world was being simplified. They are information parasites, she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. They feed on complexity. On high-order concepts. Emboldened, I told her everything. About Alastair Finch. About the Ophidian geometers. About my theory that they had erased the M-word to attack the very concept of self-reflection. As I spoke, a change came over her. A subtle shift in her unnerving stillness. Her focus, which had been sharp and analytical, seemed to soften, to glaze over. She picked up on one of my phrases. Unmaking things, she said, her voice suddenly flat, devoid of its earlier passion. Yes, that's what Finch said, I agreed, a prickle of unease on my neck. They are unmaking things, she repeated, her eyes fixed on the dark, polished surface of the wooden table between us. They unmake the things. She kept saying it, the sentence becoming a mantra, a loop. A cold dread washed over me. I watched as a small, vacant smile touched her lips. Her reflection in the dark wood of the table did not smile back. The thing wearing her face in the dim luster of the varnish, was looking directly at me. Its eyes were ancient and intelligent and utterly without pity. Valerie wasn't an ally. She was a casualty. Or worse, she was a carrier, a vessel. Her mind had been hollowed out, and something else was looking through her eyes. The parasites she had been hunting had already won. I stood up so quickly my chair scraped loudly on the floor. I threw a $20 bill on the table and fled the cafe, not daring to look back. The thing in the reflection watched me go. I was alone again, but this time it was worse. I now knew that finding a fellow observer was not a path to salvation, but an invitation to infection. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. My apartment became a bunker against the visible world. I covered the bay window with a thick, light-blocking blanket, securing it with duct tape. I draped a towel over the glossy screen of my television. I even drained the water from the toilet bowl, leaving only the dull porcelain. Every potentially reflective surface, a framed print behind glass, the face of the microwave, the blade of a kitchen knife, was either covered, hidden, or turned to the wall. I lived in a self-imposed twilight, a fortress of matte surfaces. But the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a new sound, a faint, dry, susurrus that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the building. A sound like sand trickling. Or scales whispering against plaster. The Ophidians were no longer content to live in the glass. They were bleeding through. I knew I couldn't hide forever. This wasn't a threat that could be outlasted. I sat at my desk in the gloom, my research spread before me, the printout of the article about Finch, my own journals filled with frantic scrawls, the memory of Valerie's vacant, smiling face. The confrontation I was facing wasn't going to be a physical battle. It was a choice. I could surrender. I could stop fighting, stop thinking about it, stop struggling to hold on to the lost word. I could let the soothing tide of simplification wash over me. The whispers promised peace. Forgetfulness was a balm. I could join the rest of the world in their placid, untroubled reality. The thought was seductive, a promise of relief from the crushing weight of being the only one who remembered. Or I could fight back. But how? I couldn't defeat a cosmic entity that fed on language. I couldn't smash every reflective surface on the planet. Staring at my notes, at Finch's phrase, unmaking things, and Valerie's theory of information parasites, the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about erasing a word. It was about erasing the need for the word. The Ophidians hadn't just removed the label for a self-reflecting object. They were systematically dismantling the very concept of self-reflection. Introspection. Self-awareness. Identity. These were the complex, high-order concepts they were feeding on. By removing the tool we used to literally see ourselves, they began a cascade failure of the abstract self. The simplification of language, the loss of emotional nuance, it was all part of the process. They were transforming humanity from a species of anxious, questioning, self-obsessed individuals into a placid herd. It wasn't an invasion in the way humans understood it. It was more like husbandry. Or a harvest. We were being neurologically domesticated. The sheer, chilling impersonality of it was the true terror. There was no malice, no evil. Just a process, as inexorable and unfeeling as erosion. In that moment of awful clarity, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't fight them, but I could bear witness. I took out my fountain pen and my last clean journal. The physical barrier was absolute. I knew from my first attempt that trying to write the word itself would only invite a direct, and likely final, incursion. The Ophidians guarded that specific gate fiercely. But I could write around it. I could preserve the negative space it left behind. I could define it by its absence. My pen began to move across the page, my hand trembling not with fear, but with a strange, defiant purpose. There is a concept for which we no longer have a name, I wrote. It is the idea of seeing yourself as you are seen. Of an honest and immediate reflection of the self. Not an image, not a painting, not a description from another, but a direct, one-to-one correspondence between being and seeing. The loss of this concept is the loss of the anchor of identity. As I wrote, the dry, slithering sound from the walls grew louder. The sliver of light under my apartment door warped, the shadow of the doorframe twisting into impossible, serpentine curves. A pressure built inside my skull, a soft, persuasive hum that urged me to stop. It doesn't matter, the pressure whispered. It's so much easier to forget. Just be. Don't think. Just be. I squeezed my eyes shut, blocking out the insidious promise of peace, and focused on the scratch of the nib on paper. I kept writing, my hand cramping, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the encroaching silence. I wrote about self-awareness. I wrote about memory and identity. I wrote about the color of my own eyes, and the act of confirming it by looking at the thing that had no name. I was building a sea wall of words against a tide of forgetting. The story doesn't end with an escape. There is no escape. It ends with me, Raymond, sitting in a darkened room in a quiet city, feverishly writing a lexicon of the lost. I am a ghost, chronicling a forgotten reality for an audience that can no longer understand it. I have not won. The quiet contagion has already consumed the world. But in this small, desperate room, I have become something new. I am a librarian at the end of human introspection, a lonely curator of a single, impossible idea. Sometimes, in the deepest quiet of the night, I lower the blanket just an inch and look at the black, taped-over square of the bathroom portal. The thing that is not a mirror. I know they are there, on the other side, coiled in their vast and fractal darkness. I know they are watching me. Waiting for me to falter, to tire, to finally forget. But I have not forgotten. Not yet. And in my small, defiant act of remembering, I preserve a single, flickering candle of what we were, in the encroaching, placid dark. The quiet contagion. The numbers that don't add up. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My world is built on numbers that behave. As a data analyst for Viridian Logistics, I live in a fortress of quantifiable reality. I track shipments from Shanghai to Schaumburg, calculate fuel efficiency down to the 4th decimal place, and find the elegant, hidden logic in the chaos of a million moving parts. My kingdom is a cubicle on the 27th floor of a glass and steel monolith in the Chicago Loop, my scepter a mouse, my view a grid of streets that stretch to the hazy shores of Lake Michigan. Order is not just my job, it's my sanctuary. The first crack in the foundation appeared on a Tuesday. It was subtle, small enough to be a ghost in the machine. Every digital clock in the office, the one on my monitor. The large display by the elevators, Brenda's blinking desktop phone, was off. They were all perfectly synchronized with each other, but they were exactly 13 seconds behind the time on my wristwatch, which I set weekly by the atomic clock signal. I mentioned it to Dave in the next cubicle. "Hey, are the network clocks running slow?" He glanced up from a spreadsheet mapping distribution centers. "Huh. Looks fine to me." He squinted at his screen. 9:14. "My watch says 9:14 and 13 seconds, I said. Dave gave me the kind of look you give a man talking about the healing power of crystals. "Dude, it's 13 seconds. The server probably hiccuped. Who cares?" He was right, of course. It was trivial. A rounding error in the grand scheme of the day. I chalked it up to a network time protocol glitch and moved on. But I didn't reset my watch. My watch was my control variable. A week later, the first impossible number surfaced. It was a shipment designated VL-734, a truckload of industrial-grade paper towels originating from a warehouse in Joliet, destined for a processing plant in Gary, Indiana. A simple A to B route, barely a blip on my daily reports. Except, it wasn't. According to the GPS data, the truck left Joliet, traveled east on I-80, and then, just over the Indiana border, it vanished. Not in a crash, not a lost signal. The pings just stopped. 3 hours later, they reappeared. The truck was back at the origin point in Joliet, its cargo hold still sealed, its driver, a veteran named Marcus, having no memory of the missing time. He just remembered getting on the highway and then, suddenly, being back at the loading dock, feeling like he'd just had a long blink. My system flagged it as a catastrophic data error. I spent the morning trying to untangle it. I pulled satellite imagery, cell tower triangulation data, the truck's internal diagnostics. The data was unequivocal, the truck had effectively teleported. Or, more accurately, it had executed a perfect, instantaneous loop. I took my findings to my manager, Brenda. She was a woman whose entire personality was starched and pressed. She listened patiently, her fingers steepled, a small, tight smile on her face. "So," she said, after I'd laid out the impossible timeline. "You're saying the data shows the truck was in two places at once?" "Not at once," I corrected. "It shows it traveled a 60-mile round trip in 0 seconds." Her smile didn't change. "Emmett, data isn't reality. It's a representation of reality. There was a glitch. The driver got turned around, the GPS malfunctioned, he reset it, and the system didn't log it properly. Find the glitch, patch the report. But the driver confirms the time loss. The warehouse logs confirm his return. Then find the other glitch," she said, her voice still smooth, still reasonable. "Or just override the exception. It's a pallet of paper towels, Emmett, not a shipment of plutonium. Don't spin your wheels." She turned back to her monitor, the conversation declared over. As I walked back to my desk, I heard a sound from her office. A soft, airy chuckle. It wasn't a sound of amusement. It was light and empty, like wind through a cracked window pane. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. I overrode the exception. I patched the report. But I saved the raw data to a personal, encrypted drive. It was the first entry in a file I named impossible.log. The 13-second discrepancy held steady. I started noticing it everywhere. The train schedules on the Hell platform were 13 seconds slow. The time displayed on my ATM receipt was 13 seconds behind my watch. The world's official clocks were lagging, and I seemed to be one of the few people who noticed or cared. My watch, my simple, battery-powered Casio, had become my anchor to a reality that was starting to drift. The impossible numbers kept coming. Not every day, but often enough to form a pattern.